There is a place in the Ark Raiders universe that almost nobody talks about, and once you learn what happened there, you will understand why the world ended up the way it did. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to be upfront with you. I made this video because Stella Montis kept showing up in the background of everything I was researching. Every time I pulled on a thread about the Ark invasion, about human resistance efforts, about why certain factions collapsed when they did, Stella Montis was sitting there in the margins. It felt wrong to keep glossing over it, so I decided to make it the main subject. One specific choice I made when putting this together was to lead with the facility's purpose rather than its destruction. A lot of community discussions jump straight to the event itself, the thing that went wrong, but I think you lose a lot of context if you do that. You need to understand what Stella Montis was supposed to be before you can appreciate what it became. Everything in this video is my reading of the available lore. The game gives you fragments, not a complete picture, and I have tried to assemble those fragments in the order that makes the most sense to me. Where I am speculating, I will say so. Where the evidence is strong, I will say that too. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Before the Towers Fell. Stella Montis did not begin as a military installation. That is the first thing worth establishing, because almost everything about the facility's later history gets filtered through its militarization, and people forget that it started as something else entirely. The earliest references to it in the game's documentary layer describe a high-altitude research campus purpose-built for a consortium of private scientific bodies operating under government licensing agreements. It sat at elevation, deliberately remote, and that remoteness was a feature rather than a flaw. The altitude served a specific function. Certain categories of atmospheric research, certain types of signal processing and long-range detection work required distance from population centres and their electromagnetic noise. Stella Montis offered that. It also offered defensible terrain by accident, something that would become relevant later in ways nobody at the facility originally anticipated. In the early operational period, the concerns were entirely scientific. Security meant keeping unauthorized researchers out, not keeping anything in. The founding charter of the facility, or at least what the game suggests about it through environmental and documentary law, points toward a collaboration between multiple national scientific programs. This was not unusual for the era depicted in the Ark Raiders timeline. The period before the invasion was one of intense international scientific cooperation, driven partly by optimism and partly by the shared recognition that certain problems were simply too large for any single government to address. Climate monitoring, deep space observation, communications infrastructure research, these were the kinds of projects that required pooled resources. Stella Montis seems to have hosted several of these programs simultaneously. The facility layout, as best as it can be reconstructed from in-game materials, suggests a main research block, several subsidiary laboratories arranged around it, and a residential zone for long-term staff. There were greenhouses, which points toward an expectation of extended occupancy. There were backup power systems that seem disproportionate for a purely academic campus, which suggests either that the work being done was sensitive enough to require uninterrupted power, or that the facility had been designed with some awareness that it might someday need to operate independently. That second possibility is interesting. It suggests someone, at some point during the design phase, had thought about what Stella Montis would look like if the world outside stopped being reliable. Whether that was prudent planning or something more prescient is one of the questions the lore leaves open. It is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. The staff at Stella Montis in its early period were researchers first, administrators second, and almost nothing else. The game's lore gives you glimpses of personnel files, fragments of internal communications, enough to build a rough picture of the kind of people who lived and worked there. They were specialists. Many of them had been recruited from university programs or from prior government research roles. A significant portion of them had families either on site in the residential zone or within commuting distance of the facility. That last detail matters. Stella Montis was not, in its original form, the kind of place where you sent people who had no ties. It was the kind of place where you sent people who were serious enough about their work to relocate their entire lives for it. The researchers there were committed. They had invested in the place. That investment, that sense of ownership over the mission, would become one of the defining tensions of the facility's later history. The research programs at Stella Montis in the pre-invasion period appear to have produced meaningful results. There are suggestions in the lore of publications, of data-sharing agreements with external institutions, of the kind of incremental scientific progress that rarely makes headlines but constitutes the actual substance of how knowledge advances. The facility was, by most measurable standards, doing exactly what it was built to do. And then, things began to shift. The shift was not sudden. It never is in institutions. It happened through a series of small changes, each of which seemed reasonable in isolation, that gradually accumulated into something qualitatively different from what Stella Montis had been at the start. The first change was in the funding structure. The private consortium that had originally backed the facility began to be displaced by direct government contracts. This brought money, and it brought oversight. Government contracts in the Ark Raiders setting, especially in the period when the invasion was beginning to register as a possibility rather than an abstraction, came with conditions. Priority research areas were specified. Certain lines of inquiry were encouraged, others quietly discouraged. The researchers at Stella Montis were not, most of them, naive about what this meant. Several of the internal communications that survive in the game's lore layer show people grappling explicitly with the tension between scientific independence and institutional obligation. But they stayed. That is the thing to hold on to. When the conditions changed, the people who had built their professional identities around Stella Montis did not leave. Some of them rationalized the change. Some of them embraced it. A few of them pushed back in ways that the record suggests were ultimately ineffective. But the community held together, and the facility continued to function, and the slow transformation from research campus to something else proceeded. By the time the Ark invasion began registering as an immediate existential threat rather than a distant one, Stella Montis had already been substantially remade. The atmospheric research was still happening, but it had been reoriented. The signal processing work had taken on new urgency and new direction. The facility's infrastructure had been quietly hardened. Additional personnel had arrived, not researchers in the original sense, but technical specialists of a different kind. People whose backgrounds were in systems integration, in communications security, in the kind of logistics that you need when you are planning for sustained operations in a hostile environment. The original staff watched this happen. Some of them understood, or thought they understood, what it implied. Others were kept at enough of a distance from the administrative decisions to remain genuinely uncertain. The facility had developed, as institutions under pressure often do, a layered structure of knowledge. What you knew about what Stella Montis was becoming depended heavily on where you sat within it. The Ark invasion, when it came in force, accelerated everything. Facilities that had been slowly transforming over years were suddenly being transformed over weeks. Stella Montis was no exception. The government entities that had come to depend on it moved quickly to formalize that dependence, which meant resources flowing in at a rate the facility had never previously experienced, but also directives arriving at a rate that the facility's original culture was not built to absorb. There is a phrase that appears more than once in the law materials connected to this period, and it points toward a particular kind of institutional stress. The idea, roughly, is that Stella Montis was being asked to be something it had not been designed to be, not just in terms of its physical infrastructure, but in terms of its human relationships and internal culture. The people who had been there from the beginning were increasingly finding that the place they had committed to was not quite the place they were now living in. This is not a situation unique to Stella Montis in the Ark Raiders world. The invasion reshuffled every human institution in ways that created these kinds of internal fractures. But Stella Montis is a case where those fractures seem to have mattered in ways that had significant downstream consequences. Understanding the fractures requires understanding what the facility was before they developed. The physical setting contributed to the psychology of the place. Elevation isolates. The remoteness that had originally been a scientific asset became, as the invasion intensified, something more ambivalent. The staff at Stella Montis were relatively safe, in purely physical terms, for longer than people in lower-lying or more densely populated areas. Safety, when it is distributed unevenly, has complex effects on the people who have it. There is evidence in the law that people at Stella Montis were aware of this unevenness. They had access to communications infrastructure that gave them a clearer picture of what was happening elsewhere than most surviving population centres had. They knew things. They knew them in real time, or close to it. And the knowledge of catastrophe happening at a distance while you remain temporarily protected is a particular kind of psychological weight. The decisions made under that weight by administrators and researchers and technical staff who were simultaneously safe and terrified, who had resources and responsibility and imperfect information about what was coming next, are the decisions that the law of Stella Montis is really about, not the Ark itself. The Ark is the pressure. What the law is examining is how people responded to the pressure, and whether those responses were adequate, and whether adequacy was even a meaningful standard given what they were facing. One of the early administrative decisions that the law points toward is the formalization of triage. Stella Montis, with its relatively intact infrastructure and its defensible position and its power reserves, became a node in whatever improvised network of human capability survived the initial phases of the invasion. People and resources and information were routed through it. But not everything could be accommodated. Choices had to be made about what to prioritize. The triage logic that developed at Stella Montis seems to have been driven primarily by utility. What can this person contribute to the survival effort? What does this equipment enable? What data is worth preserving, and what data can be abandoned? This is a reasonable logic under extreme pressure, and the people applying it were not, by any reading of the available law, doing so casually or callously. But utility-based triage has effects on the people being triaged, and those effects accumulated. There were researchers at Stella Montis whose work, as originally constituted, no longer served an obvious function in a world fighting for survival. The long-term atmospheric data sets, the theoretical work in certain physics domains, the archival projects, these things could not be immediately converted into survival value. What happened to the people doing that work, and to the work itself, is something the law addresses obliquely without fully resolving. Some of them pivoted. People are adaptable, and scientists in particular often find that their methodological skills transfer across domains, even when the specific content of their expertise does not. The law suggests that several of the facility's original research staff ended up contributing to the hardening and expansion of Stella Montis's communications and detection infrastructure, work that was meaningfully different from what they had trained for, but that drew on related technical knowledge. Others did not pivot, or could not. The law is careful here, or at least what survives of it suggests care, not reducing the people who could not adapt to simple failures. The circumstances were extreme, and the demands were arbitrary, in the way that all demands under crisis conditions are arbitrary. People who had spent careers developing highly specialized expertise were suddenly being measured against standards that their expertise had never been designed to meet. The facility's leadership during this period is one of the most contested elements of the Stella Montis law. There are multiple figures who appear in the surviving records as significant decision-makers, and their relationships to each other and their individual roles in the events that followed are not cleanly documented. The game gives you fragments from multiple perspectives, and those perspectives do not always agree on who was responsible for what. What seems relatively clear is that the leadership structure that had served Stella Montis as a research campus was insufficient for what the facility was becoming. Scientific administration and crisis management are different disciplines, and the people who had risen through the former were not necessarily equipped for the latter. This created space for new figures to acquire influence, people whose skills matched the new demands better than the original administrative hierarchy did. The dynamics that resulted were not simple. The original leadership did not simply step aside. The incoming technical and logistical specialists did not simply take over. What developed was a messy, contested, sometimes collaborative, and sometimes antagonistic hybrid authority structure in which multiple people believed themselves to be making the decisions, and not all of them were wrong. Hybrid authority structures under crisis conditions are historically a significant source of catastrophic institutional failure. But Stella Montis was also producing results during this period. The communications infrastructure it was developing had real value. The detection work was contributing to the broader human effort to understand arc behavior and movement. The facility was not simply spinning its wheels, it was doing things that mattered. And that productivity made it easier to defer the reckoning with the structural problems that were developing underneath the surface activity. The community that had formed at Stella Montis, the original researchers and their families and the later arrivals, developed its own culture. As the invasion deepened and the outside world became increasingly hostile, the facility became not just a workplace, but the entirety of most people's social world. The relationships formed there, the loyalties and resentments and dependencies that developed in conditions of prolonged shared danger, became load-bearing structures in the facility's social architecture. This mattered enormously for what came later. The events at Stella Montis were not just institutional failures, they were failures of a community, and communities are held together by things that organisational charts do not capture. When the things holding the community together were put under sufficient pressure, the community's response was shaped by all the history that had accumulated in the interpersonal layer, the debts and grievances and alliances that had formed over months or years of shared experience. The law gives you access to some of that interpersonal layer through fragments of personal correspondence, through audio logs, through the kind of environmental storytelling that the Ark Raiders game does well, people talking to each other about things that are not the crisis, because even in the middle of a crisis, people maintain parallel concerns about their relationships and their identities and their futures. Those parallel concerns are not irrelevant to understanding what happened. They are often where the real explanation lives. There is a recurring theme in the Stella Montis materials of people holding on to the idea that things will eventually return to normal. Not the pre-invasion normal. Most people seem to have abandoned that hope relatively early, but some future normal, some point at which the immediate pressure would ease enough that longer-term considerations could come back into view. This hope was functional. It kept people moving. But it also created a specific kind of vulnerability. When the evidence accumulated that there was not going to be a return to any recognisable normal, that the trajectory Stella Montis was on had no comfortable endpoint, the people who had been sustained by that hope experienced something more than disappointment. They experienced a reorientation of their entire understanding of what they were doing and why. And that reorientation did not happen simultaneously for everyone, which meant the community was experiencing different things at different times, with significant consequences for cohesion. The arc activity in the vicinity of Stella Montis during this period is worth noting. The facility was not in a zone of heavy arc presence initially. Its elevation and remoteness had provided a degree of protection. But arc patterns, as best as the game's law allows them to be understood, were not static. They changed. They responded in ways that might have been reactive or might have been purposive to what human settlements were doing. Whether arc activity near Stella Montis increased because the facility was becoming more significant as a human operational node, or whether the correlation between the facility's growing importance and the increasing arc interest was coincidental, is one of the genuinely open questions in the law. It matters because it bears on the question of whether the people at Stella Montis brought a particular kind of attention on themselves, and whether they understood that they might be doing so. There are suggestions in the law that some people at the facility were aware of the possibility. There are also suggestions that this awareness was not universally shared, and that within the facility's leadership there were significant disagreements about how to interpret and respond to the changing arc presence in their region. Those disagreements had operational consequences that the law points toward without fully spelling out. The resource situation at Stella Montis evolved over time in ways that compounded its other pressures. The initial infusion of government resources had been substantial. The facility had more than it had ever had. But sustaining that level of resource availability in a world where supply chains had been catastrophically disrupted required ongoing effort and ongoing connections to external entities that could provide what the facility could not produce itself. Those connections were inherently unstable. The entities that could provide resources were themselves under pressure, themselves making triage decisions, themselves navigating contested authority structures. The reliability of supply that Stella Montis had briefly enjoyed was not permanent, and the people managing the facility's resource situation spent increasing amounts of their bandwidth on securing future access to things they needed, rather than on deploying the things they currently had. This is a version of a resource trap that appears in many crisis situations. The effort required to maintain access to resources begins to crowd out the effort required to use those resources effectively. The facility's productive output, which had been increasing, began to plateau and then decline, not because the capacity was gone, but because the people managing the capacity were being redirected toward logistical and political work that kept the capacity alive but did not actually deploy it. Meanwhile, the community continued to evolve. New arrivals continued to come, people who had survived elsewhere and had been rooted to Stella Montis for one reason or another. The facility's population was growing. That growth strained the residential and social infrastructure in ways that the original design had not anticipated. The community's internal complexity was increasing, which meant the implicit agreements and informal understandings that had held it together were under more pressure to formalize or break. By the point in the timeline that most people associate with the beginning of the end for Stella Montis, the facility was already a very different place from the research campus. It had started as it was larger, more complex, more internally contested, more externally exposed, and operating under sustained stress that had already produced observable damage to its social and institutional fabric. Understanding that baseline is essential for understanding what followed, because what followed was not a sudden fall from a healthy state. It was the culmination of a long series of compounding pressures reaching a threshold. The threshold, when it came, was both predictable in retrospect and genuinely catastrophic in the moment. That gap between retrospective legibility and contemporaneous shock is one of the things the Stella Montis law seems most interested in exploring. The people there were not stupid. They were not unaware of the pressures. They were doing their best under conditions that were genuinely extraordinary. And yet the outcome was what it was. That is the setup. The facility existed. It mattered. It was full of people who were trying, under impossible conditions, to do something worthwhile. And something went terribly wrong. The rest of this video is about what went wrong, and why, and what it means for the larger Ark Raiders world. The story of Stella Montis is not really a story about Ark Raiders in the sense of being primarily a story about the Ark. It is a story about what human institutions do under extreme pressure, and how communities fracture, and how the decisions made in crisis conditions have consequences that extend far beyond the crisis itself. The Ark is the context. The story is human, which is, I think, what makes it worth spending 8 hours on. Not because it is definitive. The law does not allow for definitive readings, and I would not trust any reading that claimed to be. But because it is rich, and because the richness rewards sustained attention, and because the questions it raises are not just questions about a fictional world, they are questions about how we understand institutional failure and community dissolution, and the relationship between individual intention and collective outcome. So let's keep going. Chapter 2. The purpose behind the walls. Every facility has an official purpose and a real purpose, and at Stella Montis, the gap between those two things grew steadily wider. As the Ark invasion deepened, the official purpose, even as it evolved, always sounded reasonable. Research, coordination, communication, survival support. These were the words that appeared in the documents and the directives and the reports sent to whatever administrative bodies were still receiving reports and still had the capacity to care about them. The real purpose of Stella Montis was something that the law approaches from multiple angles without quite stating directly. It was, this reading suggests, a hedge, not a hedge in the simple financial sense of a risk reduction strategy, though there is something of that in it. A hedge in the older sense of a protected space, something set apart from the surrounding chaos, maintained at significant cost, serving a function that only made sense if you believed the chaos was temporary. The people who made the decisions that shaped Stella Montis in its middle period, the period after its initial transformation but before the events that ended it, seem to have shared a particular set of assumptions. They assumed that the Ark invasion, however catastrophic, was not permanent. They assumed that human civilization would survive in some form, and that when the immediate crisis had passed, there would be a reconstruction phase. And they assumed that what happened during the crisis would shape the reconstruction. That the institutions and knowledge and people who survived would not simply inherit a blank slate, but would inherit a world already structured by what the crisis had done. Stella Montis, in this reading, was a project of post-crisis positioning. It was being maintained not just to address the immediate situation, but to ensure that the people and institutions behind it would be in a favourable position when the immediate situation eventually resolved. That dual purpose, present tense survival and future tense advantage, is important because it explains a lot of decisions that do not make sense if you assume the facility was purely focused on the crisis at hand. The communications infrastructure that Stella Montis developed during this period is one of the clearest examples. The investment in that infrastructure significantly exceeded what would have been required for the facility's stated operational needs. You do not build that level of communications capacity purely to coordinate a local survival effort. You build it if you want to be a hub, if you want other nodes to depend on you, if you want the ability to shape information flows rather than simply participate in them. The game's lore supports this reading through what it shows about the facility's relationships with other surviving communities and institutions. Stella Montis was not just exchanging information with these other nodes. It was filtering information, curating what it passed along and what it held back. There are fragments in the law that point toward deliberate decisions about what to share and with whom. Those decisions were not purely defensive, not purely about protecting sensitive operational information from compromise. Some of them seem to have been made with an eye toward maintaining Stella Montis's relative informational advantage. Informational advantage in a crisis environment is real power. If you know things that other people do not, and if you control whether and how they learn those things, you have leverage. The people running Stella Montis understood this. Whether all of them would have articulated it in those terms is less clear. Organizations often develop practices that serve particular interests without the people implementing those practices fully understanding or acknowledging whose interests they serve. The detection work that Stella Montis was doing is another area where the official purpose and the real purpose seem to diverge interestingly. Officially, the detection research was oriented toward understanding ARC behavior in order to support defensive planning. And it did that. The work was real, and the contributions to the broader human understanding of ARC movement and pattern were genuine. But the facility's investment in detection significantly exceeded what the defensive rationale required. One reading of the excess investment is that Stella Montis was trying to understand the ARC not just to defend against it, but to predict it in ways that would allow the facility to make advantageous decisions. If you can predict where the ARC will focus its attention, you can route resources, you can position assets, you can make choices that keep you ahead of the threat in ways that other communities cannot match. Predictive advantage compounds over time. Each correct prediction gives you information and resources that improve the accuracy of your next prediction. Whether this reading is correct is genuinely uncertain. The law is not explicit about motivation. But the pattern of investment and the ways in which the detection data seems to have been used points towards something more than purely defensive application, and the consequences of that something more are part of what makes the Stella Montis story significant. There was a research program at the facility that the law references indirectly but never fully describes. The indirect references are consistent enough that it seems safe to conclude something was happening, some line of inquiry that was either sensitive enough or controversial, enough to be documented separately from the facility's main research record. The nature of that program is one of the most active areas of speculation in the ARC Raiders law community. The most conservative reading is that it was advanced materials research, something along the lines of developing new approaches to ARC-resistant construction or equipment. The materials references in the law from this period could support that reading. But there are other fragments that suggest something different, something more directly related to the ARC itself, rather than to human defensive technology, something that might be characterized, in the most careful possible language, as an attempt to understand the ARC from the inside out rather than from the outside in. What that means in practice is not something the available law fully resolves, but it connects to a broader pattern in the ARC Raiders world of human institutions attempting to engage with the ARC in ways that go beyond pure opposition, ways that involve trying to understand ARC nature, ARC logic, ARC purpose, in the hope that understanding might yield options beyond fight or flight. Stella Montis may have been one of the more serious institutional attempts at that kind of understanding. If it was, that ambition would explain several things. It would explain the resources directed toward the program. It would explain the secrecy around it, because any suggestion that a human facility was trying to understand the ARC in ways that went beyond military intelligence would have been politically explosive. It would explain certain patterns in the facility's relationship with external institutions, including what looks like active effort to prevent outside scrutiny of particular research areas. It would also explain the nature of what went wrong. Not completely, and not with certainty, but a facility attempting something genuinely unprecedented, something that pushed against the limits of what was understood about the Ark, would have been creating risks that it might not have been able to fully characterize. Risk that you cannot characterize is risk that you cannot adequately manage, no matter how competent you are. The secrecy that surrounded parts of the Stella Montis operation had practical consequences for the facility's internal culture. When a significant portion of what the facility is doing is not discussable within the broader community, the community fragments along the lines of what people know and do not know. The people with access to the restricted work exist in a different information environment from the people without it, and that asymmetry shapes social relationships in ways that go beyond the professional. There were people at Stella Montis who knew things about the facility's real purposes and practices that their colleagues, people they lived with and ate with and depended on for psychological support, did not know. The weight of that knowledge and the isolation it created is something the law suggests through the personal communications that survive, people writing to each other about ordinary things in language that sometimes carries the strain of what is not being said. The leadership structure during this period had developed its own internal logic that was not fully legible to people outside it. Decisions that looked arbitrary from the outside had rationales from the inside, but those rationales could not always be shared. This is a situation that tends to produce specific failure modes: distrust, resentment, the attribution of malicious intent to decisions that were made for reasons the decision makers believed were legitimate, but could not explain. The community's relationship to the Ark changed during this period in ways that the law points towards subtly. In the early period of the invasion, the Ark was primarily experienced at Stella Montis as an external threat. Something happening out there to other people. Something the facility's work was oriented toward addressing at a distance, but as Ark presence in the region increased, and as whatever the facility was doing in its more sensitive research areas continued, the relationship became less purely external. There is a quality to some of the late-period law from Stella Montis of people who are no longer sure what they are more afraid of, what is outside the facility or what is inside it. That is not a simple thing to communicate, and the law does not communicate it simply. It builds through accumulated detail, through shifts in tone across multiple fragments, through the gap between what people say they are concerned about and what their behaviour suggests they are actually concerned about. The facility's medical records from this period, insofar as they appear in the law, show patterns that are consistent with sustained psychological stress, anxiety, sleep disruption, the kinds of interpersonal conflict that tend to emerge in communities under pressure. These are not unusual in a crisis context, but there are also things in the medical record that do not fit that standard pattern, things that the law presents without fully explaining, that become more significant in light of what came later. The supply situation in this period was becoming critical in ways that the facility's leadership was managing but not resolving. The external connections that provided resources were becoming less reliable. The facility's own production capacity, the greenhouses, the maintenance of existing equipment, the generation of power was increasingly stretched. The gap between what the facility needed to maintain its operations and what it could reliably access was growing. Under these conditions, prioritization decisions became sharper. The triage logic that had been applied earlier became more explicit and more consequential. Resources that had previously been available for multiple purposes were being directed towards single purposes. The facility was being forced to make choices about what it was for, in a more immediate sense than the abstract strategic choices had required. Those choices surfaced the tensions that had been building in the facility's internal structure. The people doing the restricted research, or close enough to it to understand its priority within the facility's internal logic, understood why resources were being directed in particular ways. The people outside that circle saw resources being allocated according to priorities they could not understand and had not been consulted on. The resentment that generated was not abstract. It was rooted in specific decisions about specific things that specific people needed and were not getting. The facility's physical condition was also changing during this period. The sustained occupation and the resource constraints had produced visible deterioration in some areas. Systems that had been maintained were now being maintained less well. The aesthetic quality of the environment, which matters more than people sometimes acknowledge for psychological well-being, was declining. The place was beginning to look like what it was, a facility under sustained pressure, rather than what it had been designed to look like, a campus built for long-term human. Habitation. People's relationship to place is more important than institutional logic tends to account for. Stella Montis had been home to many of its inhabitants for years. The deterioration of the physical environment was experienced as a kind of loss that compounded the other losses the community had sustained. It was one more signal that things were moving in a direction that was not sustainable. The leadership responses to these conditions varied. Some of the people in positions of authority responded by tightening control, by pushing harder on the logic that had brought the facility to its current state, by insisting that the short-term costs were justified by the long-term value of what was being preserved and developed. Others began to question that logic, began to push back against the priorities that had been established, began to advocate for approaches that would be more sustainable even if they sacrificed some of the facility's ambitions. The conflict between these orientations is one of the central dramatic elements of the Stella Montis law, and it is worth dwelling on because it is not a simple conflict between wisdom and folly. The people pushing for continuity had reasons. The people pushing for change had reasons. The question of which set of reasons was more adequate to the actual situation is not one the law resolves cleanly, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the material interesting. There are records, or what the game presents as records, of formal disputes within the facility's decision-making bodies during this period, arguments about resource allocation, about the scope and direction of the research programs, about the facility's external relationships, about how to respond to changing patterns in the region. These disputes were not always resolved cleanly. Some of them were resolved in ways that left the losing side unreconciled, carrying grievances into subsequent interactions that coloured those interactions in ways that compounded over time. The external world during this period was becoming increasingly difficult to read. The communications that reached Stella Montis from other surviving nodes were less frequent and less coherent than they had been. The picture of what was happening elsewhere was fragmenting, and the facility's sense of its place in the larger human survival effort was becoming less stable. It was harder to know what you were contributing to, harder to maintain the sense of larger purpose that had sustained people through the earlier phases of the crisis. In the absence of that clarity, people at Stella Montis began to organise their sense of purpose around the facility itself, around each other, around whatever local projects felt tangible and achievable. This is a natural human response to overwhelming uncertainty. But it had the effect of narrowing the community's frame of reference in ways that would become significant when things went wrong. The consequences of decisions made at Stella Montis extended beyond the facility, but the facility's inhabitants were increasingly thinking primarily in terms of what those decisions meant locally. The restricted research program continued through this period. Whatever was happening in that space, it was not being slowed by the pressures the rest of the facility was experiencing. If anything, the law suggests It was being accelerated. The people running it seemed to have shared a conviction that they were getting close to something, that the investment was on the verge of paying off in ways that would justify everything that had been done to sustain it. Conviction of that kind is both motivating and dangerous. It motivates because it sustains effort through difficulty. It is dangerous because it makes people resistant to information that suggests they should stop or change course. When you believe you are close to a significant breakthrough, the bar for evidence that you should abandon the work rises. Costs that might otherwise be unacceptable become acceptable. Risks that might otherwise be managed become, in effect, accepted without full acknowledgement of what accepting them means. The arc presence in the region was, by this point in the timeline, elevated enough to be a constant background concern for everyone at the facility. The detection work was producing data, and the data was being interpreted, and the interpretations were not uniformly reassuring. There were patterns in the arc behaviour near Stella Montis that did not match the patterns the facility's models predicted based on arc behaviour elsewhere. Something was different about the local situation, and understanding why was a genuine priority. One reading of the divergence between the predicted patterns and the observed patterns is that Stella Montis was attracting arc attention in a way that other facilities of comparable human importance were not. If the arc was responding to something specific about what was happening at Stella Montis, that was information of critical significance. The question of whether that reading was considered and whether it was acted on appropriately is one of the things the law leaves genuinely open. The community at this point in the Stella Montis story was holding together, but under visible strain. The social bonds that had formed over years of shared experience were real and meaningful. They continued to sustain people, continued to provide the psychological resources that allowed the community to function at all. But those bonds were also under stress from the accumulated pressures of the facility's situation, and stress applied to bonds that have already been stretched does not always result in strengthening. The stage was, by this point, set for something. The precise nature of that something, and the exact sequence of events through which it developed, is what the next phase of the Stella Montis story is about. But the stage was not set by any single bad decision or any single malicious actor. It was set by an accumulation of choices, most of them individually defensible, that had together produced conditions under which something catastrophic could happen. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Stella Montis law. It does not give you a villain, it gives you a situation. And situations are harder to learn from than villains, because situations do not require extraordinary badness on anyone's part. They require only ordinary human fallibility applied consistently under conditions that would test anyone. Chapter 3. The researchers who knew too much. There is a specific set of people at Stella Montis who appear repeatedly in the law fragments from the facility's later period. And they represent something the rest of the community is organised around without fully understanding. They are the people who had the most direct involvement with the restricted research programme, the people whose knowledge of what the facility was actually attempting put them in a different relationship to the situation than everyone else. The game does not give you a complete roster. It gives you names, or partial names, and roles, and fragments of communications that let you piece together something of who these people were and what they were doing. It is enough to build an impression, though not enough to be certain. And the impression that builds is of people who were, in their own terms, doing something important, something they believed in, something that was worth the cost they were paying for it. The cost they were paying was real. The restricted research program required sustained concentration and sustained presence in an environment that was increasingly hostile to concentration. The broader facility's stresses were not insulated from the people doing the sensitive work. They still ate in the same communal spaces, still dealt with the same resource constraints, still heard the same arguments in the corridors about priorities and allocation, and what the facility owed to which of its inhabitants. But they also had something the rest of the community did not have, which is a specific sense of what the work was for. The purpose was concrete to them in a way it was not to people further from the centre of the restricted program. When you know what you are working toward, you can sustain effort that would otherwise feel aimless. The people in the restricted program were sustained by their knowledge of what they were trying to achieve, even as that knowledge isolated them from the people around them. The law suggests that the restricted researchers had developed, over time, a tight internal community. Not isolated from the rest of the facility in any formal sense, they lived and ate and moved among the broader population, but marked by their shared knowledge and their shared investment in work that they could not openly discuss. The bonds within this group were strong, and the group's internal sense of purpose was cohesive in ways that the facility as a whole was not. Strong internal cohesion in a subgroup within a larger community is not necessarily a problem. It can be a source of stability and productivity. But it can also become a source of rupture if the subgroup's interests and the broader community's interests diverge, because a cohesive subgroup will protect its own logic and its own priorities in ways that an atomized collection of individuals would not. The question the law points toward, without fully answering it, is whether the restricted researchers at some point recognized that what they were doing had implications for the broader community that they had not been transparent about, and if so, what they did with that recognition. There are fragments that suggest something like this awareness, developing in at least some of them. Notes that are careful in ways that suggest the writer is aware of an audience beyond the immediate recipient. Observations framed as questions rather than conclusions, the kind of hedged language that people use when they are trying to share something difficult without fully committing to what they are sharing. The relationship between the restricted program and the facility's leadership was not simple. The program had been established with leadership support and was sustained through leadership decisions about resource allocation. But the people doing the work were not simply executing a brief they had been handed. They were making research decisions, following lines of inquiry that emerged from the work itself, encountering things that required improvisation and judgment. The relationship was collaborative but not fully transparent, even in the direction from researchers to leadership. This is a familiar dynamic in research-intensive institutions. The people doing the work often know things about the work's progress and implications that the people funding and overseeing the work do not know, either because the details are too technical to communicate efficiently, or because the researchers are uncertain how their discoveries will be received and are not ready to share them. The uncertainty about reception is particularly significant. If you believe that what you have found will be met with administrative interference, you might be tempted to delay sharing until you have developed your findings to a point where they are harder to shut down. Whether something like that dynamic was operating at Stella Montis is speculative. But the pattern of communication between the restricted program and facility leadership in the later period of the facility's history, as reconstructed from the available law, is consistent with it. The flow of information from the research program to leadership seems to have been less complete in the later period than it had been earlier. The researchers were sharing results but not process, outcomes but not the specific observations and decisions that produced those outcomes. The external world's increasing incoherence made this dynamic harder to correct. When the facility's connections to other institutions were reliable, there was more external pressure and external oversight, more mechanism by which concerns about what was happening inside the restricted program might have been raised or addressed. As those connections degraded, the facility's internal dynamics became more self-contained. What happened inside Stella Montis was increasingly judged by Stella Montis's own standards, without the corrective pressure that external accountability can provide. The restricted program appears to have made what the researchers considered a significant advance at some point in the later period of the facility's history. The law around this is particularly fragmentary and particularly contested in the law community. But there are enough consistent signals across different fragments to suggest that something changed in the character of the research, that a qualitative shift occurred that moved the work from investigation to something more active, more direct. What that active, direct engagement was is where the speculation really opens up. The most conservative reading is that it was some form of enhanced detection work, a more sophisticated approach to reading arc signals or patterns. A more expansive reading suggests something like an attempt at communication, or at least at a form of attention-getting, directed at the arc itself. The most expansive readings go further, but those readings require filling in gaps with invention rather than inference, and this video is trying to stay grounded in what the law actually suggests. Even the conservative reading has significant implications. Enhanced detection, at the level the restricted program seems to have been pursuing, would not have been passive. It would have generated emissions, would have involved active probing, rather than purely passive observation. Active probing of a phenomenon that you do not fully understand, in a context where that phenomenon has already demonstrated the capacity to do catastrophic damage, carries risks that are not trivial to quantify. Whether those risks were quantified, whether anyone at the facility had done the work of systematically characterizing what could go wrong and how likely each scenario was, is something the law does not confirm. There are fragments that suggest some level of risk analysis was done. There are other fragments that suggest people were operating on intuitions and hopes, rather than on careful probabilistic reasoning about failure modes. The community around the restricted researchers during this period was aware that something was happening in the program. Even people without access to its details could register. That the tone of the researchers had changed, that the rhythms of the work were different, that something had shifted. The awareness was experienced differently by different people. Some found it reassuring, evidence that the facility's most significant investment was paying off. Others found it unsettling, without being able to say exactly why. The facility's detection system was, during this period, producing readings that were being interpreted as elevated arc interest in the region. The technical staff responsible for monitoring those readings were flagging them with increasing urgency. The leadership's response to those flags is one of the things that the law is most pointed about. Not that the flags were ignored, they were not, but that they were interpreted through a framework that had been shaped by the assumptions of the restricted research program. Assumptions that the people doing the monitoring did not all share. Interpretation is not a neutral act. When you have significant investments in a particular understanding of a situation, you tend to interpret new information in ways that are consistent with that understanding. This is not dishonesty. It is a feature of how human cognition works under conditions of uncertainty. But it is a feature that can produce systematic error. And systematic error in an environment where the stakes are high and the margins for error are narrow is genuinely dangerous. There were people at Stella Montis who were not embedded in the framework of the restricted research program, who were looking at the detection data from a different vantage point and who were arriving at different interpretations. The law gives you fragments of their perspective, usually through the kind of internal documentation that does not have an obvious audience, notes written for themselves or for records that they may not have expected anyone to read. Those alternative interpretations were not, in the moment, prevailing. The authority structure at the facility and the social authority that comes from being close to a project that is believed to be significant meant that the framework of the restricted research program was more influential in shaping how the detection data was understood than the alternative interpretations could be. This is not unusual. It is how institutions work, but it is how institutions sometimes make catastrophic errors. The researchers who knew too much were also, by this point in the story, people who had been living with a particular kind of sustained stress for an extended period. The psychological demands of the restricted work, combined with the ambient stress of the facility's broader situation, had left marks. The law does not dwell on this in a clinical way, but it is present in the texture of the personal communications, in the quality of attention that people bring to mundane things when they are trying to rest a mind that will not fully rest. Exhaustion affects judgment, not just in the obvious ways, not just by slowing reaction time or degrading attention. It affects judgment in subtler ways, by reducing the energy available for the kind of careful, self-critical thinking that catches errors before they propagate. When you are very tired and very invested in a particular path, you tend to do the work of staying on that path on autopilot, trusting your established framework rather than interrogating it afresh with each new piece of information. The facility's medical staff seem to have been aware of the strain the restricted researchers were under. There are fragments that suggest recommendations were made, that conversations happened between medical staff and leadership about the sustainability of the pace at which the restricted program was operating. Those conversations appear not to have resulted in significant changes. The logic, as best as it can be reconstructed, was that the program was close enough to its objective that the costs of slowing down exceeded the costs of continuing. Close enough to its objective. That phrase, or something like it, appears in the law in a way that suggests it was an actual argument made in actual discussions at the facility. It is one of the most dangerous phrases in institutional life, because it encodes a commitment to a particular timeline that then shapes every subsequent decision about risk and resource and priority. When you have decided you are close, you have already made certain decisions about what you will and will not do based on that assessment. The broader community at Stella Montis in this late period was living through something they did not have a fully accurate map of. They knew the facility was under pressure. They knew something significant was happening in the restricted research. They knew the ARC presence nearby was elevated. They did not know how those things were related, or whether they were related, or what the combined implications of the three facts were. Living with incomplete information in a high-stakes environment is psychologically demanding in ways that are not always legible from the outside. People develop coping mechanisms. They focus on what they can understand and control. They build stories that make the situation feel more navigable than it might otherwise be. Those stories are not necessarily wrong, but they are rarely fully right either, and when events move in ways that do not fit the stories, the adjustment required is not just informational, but psychological. The final period before the event that ended Stella Montis was, from the fragments the law provides, a period of elevated but not yet catastrophic tension. People were anxious. The facility's rhythms were disrupted. There were arguments and silences, and the specific quality of interpersonal interaction that develops in communities that know something is coming, but do not know what. But the facility was still functioning. People were still getting up in the morning and doing their work and maintaining the social routines that held the community together. And then something happened. Not all at once. Not with the clean, dramatic shape that retrospective accounts tend to impose on events. It happened in pieces, each piece triggering the next in ways that were not fully predicted by anyone who was there. And the pieces added up to something that nobody at the facility had planned for, not because they had not thought about risk, but because the specific risk that materialized was not quite the risk anyone had fully imagined. The researchers who knew too much knew at some point before the end that things had gone wrong. When exactly they knew it, and what they did with that knowledge, and whether there was anything they could have done that would have changed the outcome, are questions the law allows you to ask, but does not allow you to answer with confidence. They are the right questions, though. They are the questions that the Stella Montis story most insistently points toward. What the facility was for, what its people were trying to do, and what happened when the attempt went further than the situation could support. This is the shape of the story. The details fill in the shape, but the shape itself is legible from the fragments, and it is a shape that has meaning beyond the specific fictional context. It is the shape of human ambition meeting the limits of human knowledge in conditions where the consequences of excess are immediate and severe. The researchers carried their knowledge with them through the events that followed. Some of what they knew died with them. Some of it survived in the records that the game gives you access to. Fragmented and partial but present, leaving traces that you can follow if you are willing to look carefully. Following those traces is how you get to an understanding of Stella Montis that is more than a summary of the disaster. It is an account of the people who were inside it, and what they were trying to do, and what it cost them. That understanding will carry us through the next phase of this story, which is about the disaster itself. But I want to spend a moment sitting with the researchers before we get there, because they tend to get lost in the telling. When things go catastrophically wrong, the people who are closest to the cause of the catastrophe become, in subsequent accounts, primarily agents of the catastrophe. Their full humanity, their genuine motivations, their actual experiences of the events get subsumed into their role in the story. The researchers at Stella Montis were people doing something they believed was important, in conditions that were already extreme, under pressures that would have tested anyone. What they did was consequential in ways they may not have fully understood. But they were not simply instruments of destruction. They were people, with the full complexity that implies, and the Stella Montis law treats them with something approaching that complexity, even when it holds them accountable for the consequences of their choices. Chapter 4. The Day the Signal Changed. There is a point in the Stella Montis law where the tone shifts, not dramatically, not with any single line that marks the transition clearly, but across the fragments from the facility's later period, there is a perceptible change in what people are describing and how they are describing it. The change is consistent enough across multiple independent sources that were not writing for each other and were not aware of a shared audience, that it feels reliable as an indicator of something real in the events. The shift in tone corresponds. In the timeline, the law allows you to reconstruct to a period when the restricted research program's activities seem to have changed in character. Before this point, the references to the program in external communications, in records kept by people who were aware of its existence but not its details, tend to describe it in terms of investigation and development. After this point, the references tend to describe it in terms of results and responses. Results implies that something was achieved. Responses implies that something happened in consequence of the achievement. These are not the same as saying the program succeeded in any simple sense. Results can be unexpected, responses can be unwanted. But the shift from a vocabulary of process to a vocabulary of outcome marks a real transition in the facility's situation. The detection data from this period is, of the Stella Montis law materials, among the most technically specific and also among the most difficult to interpret. The Arc Raiders game does not give you a physics textbook, and the readings described in the law materials are described in terms that are internally consistent without being transparent about exactly what they measure or mean, but the pattern of the readings, the direction in which they change, and the rate at which they change, is legible enough to support some inferences. The readings that the facility's technical staff were seeing in the period after what seems to have been the program's significant advance were different from the readings before it. The specific character of the difference is harder to pin down, but the consistent theme across multiple technical log fragments is of arc behaviour in the region becoming less like the broader ambient patterns that characterise the invasion generally, and more like something with a local orientation, a specific focus on a specific point. Whether that point was Stella Montis itself, whether the facility had somehow attracted focused arc attention rather than the ambient attention that accompanied the invasion more generally, is one of the interpretive questions that the law most directly raises without resolving. The people at the facility who were looking at the data were asking the same question. Their answers differed. The technical staff's position in this debate is interesting because they were in the most direct contact with the data and had the least investment in the restricted research program's framework for understanding it. Their interpretations tended toward the more alarming end of the range of available interpretations, not because they were more pessimistic by nature, but because they were reading the data without the prior commitments that shaped how others read it. Alarm, when it is not universally shared, creates a particular kind of tension. The people who are alarmed know something that the people who are not alarmed do not know, or at least are not fully registering. They have the experience of seeing clearly something that others are not seeing, and the frustration of not being able to make that vision compelling to the people who have the authority to act on it. This is a specific and extremely unpleasant psychological position, and the law gives you fragments of people experiencing it. The leadership's position in this period was one of genuine difficulty. They were receiving conflicting interpretations of the detection data. They had significant investments in the framework of the restricted research program that shaped one set of interpretations. They were also responsible for a large community and could not simply act on every alarm without evaluating its credibility. The evaluation of credibility in conditions of high uncertainty and high stakes is an extremely difficult judgment, and the law does not simplify the difficulty. But there is evidence in the law that some specific protective measures were delayed during this period, in ways that, retrospectively, look like errors. Not dramatic failures of duty, not willful disregard for safety, but delays, hesitations, prioritizations that put the continuation of the restricted research program above precautionary measures that some people were advocating for. The delays were each individually defensible. Together, they created a vulnerability. The community's daily life during this period carried on in ways that were remarkable given the tension in the facility's leadership and technical layers. People ate. People maintained equipment. People had conversations that were about ordinary things and about extraordinary things, and about the peculiar middle ground that develops in communities under prolonged stress. Conversations that are technically about ordinary things, but carry the weight of the extraordinary underneath them. There are fragments of this daily life in the law that are, in the context of what you know is coming, among the most affecting materials in the game. People planning things. People expressing hopes. People having the kind of mundane disagreements that only happen when you are not yet in the worst of it, because when the worst is happening, you do not have the bandwidth for disagreements about mundane things. The mundane disagreements are evidence that the community is still, in some sense, intact. The restricted research program's activities in this period are described in the law through the lens of what they produced, rather than through direct documentation of what was done. The records of the program itself were either kept separately or were destroyed, or were never fully committed to documentation in the first place. What you have is the effects, the readings, the changes in the facility's situation that can be attributed to what the program was doing. Those effects were cumulative. Each step in the program's activities produced a change in the local situation, and each change produced further changes in a sequence that the people at the facility were trying to understand in real time without the benefit of a complete model of what they were dealing with. Real-time understanding of a developing situation is always incomplete. The question is whether the incompleteness is manageable, whether you have enough understanding to make good decisions, or whether the gaps in your understanding are in precisely the places where you most need to know things. At Stella Montis, the evidence suggests the gaps were in exactly the wrong places. Not because the researchers were incompetent, but because what they were dealing with was genuinely novel, genuinely beyond the range of what prior understanding had prepared them for. They were, in the most literal sense, operating at the frontier of what was known. The frontier is where discoveries happen, but it is also where you run into things that your existing frameworks cannot handle. The first moment that something clearly went wrong is not the disaster itself. It is something earlier, something that in retrospect can be seen as a precursor, as the first instance of the local situation moving faster and further than the people managing it had anticipated. The law is careful about this precursor, giving you enough to know it happened, and enough to understand its significance without fully spelling out its nature. What the precursor produced was a period of extremely intense activity at the facility. Not panic, at least not initially, but the kind of focused emergency response that people fall into when something has gone wrong, but it is still possible, in principle, too. Address: the restricted program's personnel working at a pace that exceeded what they had been sustaining, the technical staff recalibrating and reinterpreting their data. Leadership making decisions quickly, without the deliberation that the earlier situation had permitted. Quick decisions in high-stakes situations are necessary, but they are also where the errors accumulate. The conditions that make deliberation difficult are precisely the conditions in which deliberation is most valuable. When you are moving fast under pressure, you default to your existing frameworks, your existing assumptions, your existing understanding of what the situation is and what the available options are. If those frameworks are adequate, the quick decisions tend to be reasonable. If they are not, the quick decisions tend to compound whatever problem produced the emergency. The community at large registered that something was happening without knowing what. The rhythms of the facility changed. People who were usually available were suddenly unavailable. Access to certain areas, which had always been restricted, became more stringently restricted. The background anxiety that had been a constant feature of the facility's social environment intensified. People talked to each other about what they were noticing, building partial pictures from partial information. The social fabric of the community in this period is one of the things the law traces with particular care. The bonds between people, the way that sustained shared experience had created a community with its own internal history and its own sense of identity, are visible in how people talk to each other in this period. They relied on each other. They shared what they knew. They tried to maintain the ordinary routines that signalled normalcy, even when normalcy was clearly compromised. But the information asymmetries that had developed over the facility's history were now more consequential than they had been. The people who knew things, who were directly involved in managing whatever was unfolding, could not share what they knew with the people who needed to make good decisions about their own safety. The result was a community making choices based on incomplete information, which is always the case in crisis situations, but is more dangerous when the people who have relevant information are structurally prevented from sharing it. The ARC activity in the region during this period escalated. The detection data, which had been showing locally unusual patterns, showed patterns that were no longer locally unusual in the sense of being different from the general regional trends, but that were alarming in absolute terms. The ARC was responding to something, whether that something was the restricted program's activities or some other aspect of the facility's situation was still not definitively established. But the response was real, and it was intensifying. There were evacuation discussions during this period, not facility-wide evacuation plans, not at first, but discussions about specific populations, about the most vulnerable community members, about whether and how to move people who were not essential to the facility's active operations to locations with lower ARC exposure. These discussions are significant because they indicate that at least some of the people in positions of authority had concluded that the situation might not resolve in favour of the facility remaining safe. The discussions did not result in evacuation, They resulted in plans, in preparation, in the kind of pre-positioning of resources and identification of routes that constitutes readiness without commitment. The reasons for not proceeding to actual evacuation are multiple and not fully clear from the law. Some of them were practical. Evacuating people in an environment with elevated arc activity carries its own significant risks. Some of them were political. The decision to begin evacuating would have communicated to the broader community a level of concern that leadership was not ready to communicate. Some of them seem to have been tied to the restricted research program's continuing work and the sense that progress was being made. The signal that gives this chapter its name is a specific event in the detection record from this period, something that appears in the law materials from multiple independent sources, and that stands out from the surrounding data in ways that even lay readers of the materials can recognize. It represents a change in the arc activity's character, a shift from what had been a pattern of intensification to something qualitatively different, something that the people monitoring the data interpreted as a transition from a preparatory state to an active one. What that transition meant in practical terms was that the window for certain kinds of response was closing. The time when a particular set of options was available was ending, not because anyone had chosen to end it, but because the situation had developed to a point where those options were no longer viable. This is one of the most painful aspects of the Stella Montis story. The point at which the best available options were foreclosed was not the point of maximum drama. It was earlier, quieter, a data point in a technical log that was significant only in retrospect. The facility's response to the signal change was, by most readings of the law, inadequate to what the signal indicated, not because the people responding were negligent, but because the frameworks they were using to interpret the signal led them to see it as requiring a different magnitude of response than a less invested reading would have indicated. They were managing a situation that they understood in terms of their own frameworks, and their frameworks told them the situation was something other than what it was becoming. The last hours before the events that ended Stella Montis, as reconstructed from the law, were hours of intense activity across every level of the facility. The restricted program personnel were working with an urgency that had moved past the focused emergency response of the earlier period into something rawer. The technical staff were monitoring data that was moving faster than they could fully process. Leadership was making decisions in conditions of genuine confusion, trying to maintain some coherent picture of a situation that was becoming more complex faster than any single person could track. The community was holding together still, in the specific sense that the social bonds had not broken. People were still looking after each other, still sharing what they had, still doing the things that communities do. But the social fabric was under a strain that it had not previously experienced, and the strain was concentrated in the asymmetry between the people who knew what was happening and the people who did not. The event itself, when it came, was not a single moment. It was a sequence of moments, each following from the last, with a logic that was not fully visible to the people inside it. The sequence had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and at each stage the options available were different from what they had been at the previous stage, and the people making decisions were working with information that was always behind the actual situation by some interval of time that varied and that they could not precisely measure. What happened at Stella Montis, in the most direct terms the law supports, was that something the facility's restricted program had engaged with, something it had, in the program's own terms, made contact with, responded in ways the program had not predicted and could not immediately contain. The response was not localized to the program. It involved the broader facility, the broader community, the broader physical environment. It had consequences that extended beyond the facility's boundaries and that left marks in the Ark Raiders world that you can still read if you know where to look. Chapter 5. What the survivors carried out. Not everyone at Stella Montis was there when it ended. Some people had left before the final events, some voluntarily, and some through the evacuation preparations that had been partially implemented. Some people survived the events themselves. The people who got out carried things with them, both physical things and things that were not physical, and the trace of what they carried is one of the ways the Stella Montis story persists into the broader Ark Raiders world. The physical things that were carried out are documented in part through subsequent records, through references to materials that had originated at Stella Montis showing up in other locations, being referenced by people who had not been at the facility. Some of what was carried out was research data, records of what the program had done and what it had produced. Some of it was more mundane, the personal possessions of people who had lived at the facility and who brought with them whatever mattered most to them as they left. The research data that survived is the most significant category from the perspective of the broader Ark Raiders narrative. If the restricted program had produced results, and the law strongly suggests it had produced something, then whatever documentation of those results was carried out represents both information and risk. Information about what had been achieved. Risk because the same information that might be useful for understanding what happened at Stella Montis might also be useful for trying to replicate what the program had done, and replication carried the same risks the original program had encountered. The people who carried the research data out were not all in the same category. Some of them were members of the restricted program who had a deep understanding of what the data represented and what it implied. Some of them were administrators or technical staff who had the data but not the full context for interpreting it. The difference matters because the data's significance and the risks associated with its misuse would not be equally apparent to everyone who had access to it. The law hints at subsequent efforts to account for what had left Stella Montis and with whom. This is not a clean story of orderly documentation. The events at the facility were not the kind of events that produce clean documentation. People left in conditions of urgency. What was taken, and by whom, was not always recorded and was sometimes disputed. The picture that subsequent accounts assemble is partial and internally inconsistent in ways that reflect the chaotic conditions of the departure. Among the survivors were people from every part of the facility's community, researchers from both the restricted and the broader programs, technical and administrative staff, medical personnel, families who had been residing at the facility. The composition of the survivor group reflects the partial and improvised nature of the evacuation rather than any coherent triage logic. The people who got out were the people who happened to be in positions where getting out was possible when getting out became necessary. The experiences of the survivors in the immediate aftermath are described in the law through personal accounts and through what those accounts reveal about the psychological impact of having been through something that they could not fully describe or explain to people who had not been there. There is a recurring quality to these accounts of struggling with the gap between experience and language, of trying to communicate the character of the events without having adequate words for it. This linguistic difficulty is not simply a function of trauma, though trauma is certainly present. It is also a function of the events themselves having been of a character that resisted description in ordinary terms. The people at Stella Montis, in their final period, were witnessing things that their prior frameworks did not have categories for. The absence of categories makes experience harder to communicate, even to yourself, even in internal records that were not written for an audience. The survivors dispersed, not all at once, and not all to the same places. The network of surviving human communities in the Ark Raiders world was sparse and uneven, and the Stella Montis survivors joined it at various points, bringing with them their experience and their knowledge, and the specific quality of perspective that comes from having been inside something catastrophic and having gotten out. Their presence in those communities was not uncomplicated. People who survive catastrophic events carry a complex mixture of guilt, relief, grief, and something that is hard to name, but that has to do with having been irrevocably changed by an experience that the people around them have not had. The Stella Montis survivors were navigating this complexity, while also navigating the ordinary challenges of surviving in a world that was still under arc assault. Some of them talked about what had happened. Some of them refused to, or found that they could not produce a coherent account even when they tried. Some of them gave accounts that were selective, that emphasized certain aspects of the events and minimized or omitted others. The selectivity was not always deliberate or dishonest. Memory under conditions of trauma is selective in ways that are often beyond conscious control. The accounts that survive in the game's lore layer reflect this diversity. You get multiple versions of the Stella Montis events from multiple survivor perspectives, and the versions do not all agree. Some of the disagreements are factual, about what happened when and in what sequence. Some are interpretive, about what the events meant and what caused them, and some are more fundamental, about the character of the experience itself, about what it was like to be inside those events as they unfolded. One of the most significant things that survivors carried out was knowledge of the restricted research program's activities, the nature of what the program had been attempting, and the character of what it had encountered. This knowledge, depending on who had it and how complete it was potentially both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because understanding what had happened at Stella Montis was important for understanding the broader situation with the Ark. Dangerous for the same reason that the original program's data was dangerous. Different survivors handled this knowledge differently. Some shared it widely with whoever they thought had the need and capacity to use it. Others were protective of it, sharing selectively based on their own judgment about who could be trusted with it and what they would do with it. Still others seem to have buried it, at least initially, because the process of sharing it required revisiting experiences they were not yet ready to revisit. The downstream effects of these different choices are traceable in the lore, though not with perfect clarity. Communities and factions that received information from Stella Montis survivors made decisions based on that information, and those decisions had consequences. The quality and completeness of the information they received shaped what those decisions were, which means that the choices made by individual survivors about what to share and with whom had ripple effects that extended far beyond those individual survivors' immediate situations. There were also things the survivors carried that they did not know they were carrying. Not necessarily in a supernatural sense, though the lore leaves that door slightly open. More in the sense of knowledge that they had absorbed during their time at Stella Montis, but had not consciously registered as significant, observations and experiences and fragments of understanding that were sitting in their memories, waiting to become relevant in some future context. The way that information acquired in one setting only becomes fully legible in another. Some survivors found that their understanding of their Stella Montis experience shifted over time as they encountered new situations that illuminated what they had witnessed. Something they had seen during the events that they had not been able to interpret became interpretable in light of subsequent events. The retrospective clarity was not always welcome, because sometimes it revealed things about what they had been part of that they had preferred not to fully understand. The communities that absorbed Stella Montis survivors were changed by them, not dramatically, usually, but the presence of people who had been through what the survivors had been through introduced things into those communities that had not been there before. Ways of talking about the Ark, ways of thinking about what human institutions could and could not accomplish in the current situation, ways of understanding risk and capability, and limitation. Some of those introductions were valuable, some were disruptive, some were both. Factions within the Ark Raiders world that had connections to what Stella Montis had been doing, that had been invested in the facility's work or dependent on its output, had to reckon with its end in ways that had direct operational consequences. The communications infrastructure that Stella Montis had served as a node for had to be rerouted or rebuilt. The detection data the facility had been producing was no longer being produced. The knowledge the restricted research program had been generating was now distributed among a dispersed survivor population rather than concentrated in an institutional context. That dispersal was, in some ways, a protection. Knowledge distributed across many individual people is harder to control, harder to suppress, harder to lose in a single event. But it is also harder to integrate, harder to build on, harder to use in the coordinated way that institutional knowledge enables. The dispersal of Stella Montis's knowledge created both opportunities and losses for the entities that cared about what the facility had known. There is a lineage in the Ark Raiders world that runs from Stella Montis, through its survivors, and through what they knew and who they told, and what those people did with what they were told. The lineage is not clean, and it is not well documented, but it is there, traceable in the fragments of subsequent history that the game gives you access to. Following the lineage is one of the ways you can understand why certain developments in the Ark Raiders world happened when and how they did. The physical location of Stella Montis itself became, after the events, a place with a specific character in the world's geography. Not just a destroyed facility, though it was that. Something more loaded, more freighted with meaning, more present in the minds of the people who knew what it had been and what had happened there. The lore does not tell you that people avoided it, though some did. It tells you that the place continued to register, to matter, to be relevant in ways that a simply destroyed facility would not have been. What remains at Stella Montis, in the physical sense, is something the game lets you encounter directly. The environmental storytelling of the location, the arrangement of what was left behind, the way the space has been changed by the events, tells a story that complements and complicates the documentary record. Seeing the place as it is after the events, and holding that image alongside the picture you have built of what it was before and during, is one of the experiences that the game is most designed to provide. The survivors who went back, if any of them did, would have had a particular experience of that juxtaposition. Standing in a place that you knew from inside, that had been the full extent of your world for a period of time, and seeing it as it has become. The lore does not document this experience directly, but it is implied by the presence of the location in the game world, available for anyone to visit, available to be encountered without the prior knowledge that makes it what it is. What the survivors carried out of Stella Montis was, ultimately, a part of the story that could not be reconstructed from the physical remains alone. The physical remains tell you what happened to the place. The survivors tell you what happened to the people. And the full story of Stella Montis requires both. Requires the place and the people, the structural account and the human account, held in relation to each other rather than substituted for each other. That is the argument for making a video like this, for spending this much time on a facility that the game does not put at the centre of its explicit narrative. The explicit narrative is about what the Ark is and how to fight it. The lore at the margins, the story of places like Stella Montis and the people who were there, is about what happens to human beings when they are trying to address something that exceeds their capacity. The two stories are related. The second one illuminates the first, and the second one is where the kind of understanding lives that makes the first one more than just a game. Chapter 6. The Ark's interest in human ambition. The question of why the Ark does what it does is one that the Ark Raiders game holds carefully open. The design choice is deliberate, and it is a good one, because a fully explained Ark is less interesting than one whose behaviour suggests logic without making that logic transparent. But Stella Montis occupies a specific place in the conversation about Ark behaviour, and what happened there offers one of the more suggestive data points in the attempt to understand what the arc is and what drives it. The standard framing of arc behavior in the game treats the arc primarily as a destructive force, as something that acts on human settlements and human infrastructure without apparent regard for what those settlements and that infrastructure represent or contain. This framing is supported by a lot of evidence. The arc does not, in most documented cases, seem to differentiate between human communities on the basis of their activities or their significance. The scale of destruction is broadly correlated with the density and vulnerability of what is being acted on, not with its specific character. But Stella Montis does not fit that pattern cleanly. The evidence that the arc's behaviour near Stella Montis was specifically different from its behaviour in the broader region is, this reading suggests, real evidence of something. The question is what that something is. Whether the arc was responding to the character of what the facility was doing, or to some physical property of the facility's activities, or to something else entirely, is not something the law settles definitively. But it is something worth taking seriously. If the arc was responding to the character of the restricted research program's work, that implies a level of engagement with human activity that the standard framing of arc behaviour does not easily accommodate. It implies that the arc is, in some sense, aware of what humans are doing and capable of responding to specific characteristics of that activity rather than just to its physical scale or intensity. That is a significantly more complex model of arc behaviour than the one that most people are working with. The game's law in other contexts offers some support for that more complex model. There are fragments scattered across multiple locations and accounts that suggest the arc's behaviour is not purely mechanistic, not simply a function of physical inputs, producing physical outputs. There are suggestions of something like response to meaning, to significance, to the quality rather than just the quantity of human activity. Stella Montis fits into that pattern, is one of the more substantial data points for that pattern. What the restricted research program was doing that might have attracted arc attention is something worth thinking about. If the program was attempting to engage with the arc in some direct way, attempting to understand it from the inside rather than purely from the outside, then the program was doing something that was different in kind from the defensive work that constituted the vast majority of human activity in relation to the arc. It was attempting to reduce the distance between human understanding and arc nature, to close the gap that the invasion had created and maintained. Whether the arc has something like awareness of that gap, whether it registers the difference between humans who are purely defending against it and humans who are trying to understand it, is one of the genuinely speculative areas of this discussion. But it is speculation that the Stella Montis material supports rather than undermines. The pattern of arc behaviour around the facility is more consistent with a response to what the facility was specifically doing than with a response to the facility's physical characteristics alone. There is a broader philosophical question embedded in this, one that the Arc Raiders world raises through Stella Montis, among other things. What is the relationship between human ambition and arc behaviour? Is human ambition to understand the arc something that the arc responds to differently than human ambition to survive it? Is the arc of human understanding, the effort to make sense of the invasion on terms beyond pure opposition, something that has particular consequences in a world where the arc is not simply a natural phenomenon, but something with more complex properties? These are questions the law raises rather than answers. But they are questions that Stella Montis makes concrete. The facility was not just a place where people were trying to survive. It was a place where people were trying to understand, and the specific attempt to understand, taken seriously enough and developed far enough, seems to have had consequences that the attempt to merely survive would not have had. The Arc's interest in human ambition, if that is the right framing, is a discomforting idea. It implies that the very human qualities that might be most valuable for eventually addressing the arc, curiosity, ambition, the drive to understand, are also the qualities that make certain human activities more dangerous in an arc-active world. The thing that might eventually lead to a solution is also the thing that creates additional risk in the near term. This is not a simple dilemma. It is the kind of dilemma that does not have a clean resolution, where both horns are real and both consequences are genuine. The people at Stella Montis were navigating that dilemma, not with full awareness of its structure, not with the benefit of a clear analysis of what they were choosing between, but navigating it nonetheless through the decisions they made about what to pursue and how hard to pursue it, and what risks to accept in service of that pursuit. The aftermath of Stella Montis, in terms of what it communicated to other human communities and institutions about the risk of certain kinds of arc engagement, is something the law addresses through the behaviour of those communities and institutions in subsequent events. The lesson that was taken from Stella Montis was not uniform. Some factions read the events as evidence that certain lines of inquiry should be abandoned entirely. Others read them as evidence that those lines of inquiry needed to be pursued more carefully, with better preparation and better risk management. Others seem to have read them as evidence that success was closer than the events might suggest, that the failure at Stella Montis was an instructive failure rather than a terminal one. The diversity of lessons drawn from the same events is itself significant. It reflects the fact that the events were genuinely ambiguous, that they could support multiple interpretations, and that which interpretation you favoured depended substantially on prior commitments that went beyond the events themselves. The Stella Montis disaster was not so clear-cut that it could only be read one way, and different actors in the Arc Raiders world read it differently in ways that shaped their subsequent choices. The Arc's behaviour in the period after the Stella Montis events is one of the data points people use to evaluate those different readings. Whether the Arc's regional behaviour changed in ways that support the interpretation that the events had significance for the Arc, or whether the post-event Arc behaviour is consistent with the standard patterns that do not depend on Stella Montis having had specific significance, is a question the law addresses but does not resolve cleanly. Both readings can find support in the available data, which is typical of genuinely complex situations. What is perhaps most significant about the Arc's interest in Stella Montis, to the extent that interest existed, is what it implies about the nature of the relationship between the Arc and humanity. If the Arc is something that responds to human activities in ways that go beyond simple physical interaction, then the relationship is more complex than a simple predator-prey dynamic. It is something that has more dimensions, more possible modes, more potential for interaction of various kinds. Stella Montis may have been an inadvertent probe of those dimensions, a test conducted under conditions that did not allow for careful interpretation of the results. The game leaves open the possibility that there is something to be learned from that test, something that the Stella Montis survivors and the data they carried out and the experiences they had make available to the world, if the world has the resources and the framework to use it. Whether the survivors or the factions they connected with were in a position to do that learning, whether the circumstances of the post-Stella Montis world made it possible to treat what happened there as a lesson rather than simply as a loss, is one of the open questions that the game does not answer but consistently points toward. The Arc in this reading of the Stella Montis law is not simply a destructive force. It is something that interacts with human activity in ways that are complex enough to reward study, that has patterns which are informative if you can get enough distance from them to read the pattern rather than just the individual events. Stella Montis produced some of the most informative data about those patterns at enormous cost. Whether the cost was worth what was produced is not a question that has a clean answer, but the question itself and the data that makes it possible to ask the question are part of what the Stella Montis law contributes to the broader Ark Raiders world. Not just a story of catastrophe, but a story of a specific kind of engagement with the central problem of the game's world, and of the consequences of that engagement, and of what those consequences reveal about the nature of the problem itself. The lore around Stella Montis and Ark behaviour contains some of the game's most interesting speculative territory. The game is careful not to over-schematise, not to offer a complete theory of what the Ark is or how it works. But in the specificity of what it shows about the Stella Montis situation, about the divergence of Ark behaviour in that region from broader patterns, it opens doors that reward sustained attention. Doors that this video is trying to walk through, carefully, without claiming more certainty than the material supports. The Ark's interest in human ambition, if that is what Stella Montis represents, is one of the most important ideas in the game's lore. It reframes the relationship between the Ark and humanity in ways that have significant implications for how you understand the game's world and the choices that people in that world are making. It suggests that the conflict is not simply between human capability and Ark destructiveness, but between a human drive to understand and something that responds to that drive in ways that are neither purely hostile nor purely indifferent. That is a more interesting and more complex story than a simple invasion narrative. And it is, this reading suggests, what the Stella Montis law is most fundamentally about. Not the disaster, though the disaster is real and important, but what the disaster reveals about the deeper structure of the relationship between the human world and the Ark. The disaster is the data point. The deeper structure is what the data point is evidence of. Chapter 7. Fragments from the Wreckage. The materials that survive from Stella Montis are not a coherent archive. They are fragments, gathered from multiple sources, in multiple formats, with varying degrees of reliability and completeness. Working with them requires accepting that the picture you can build from them will always be partial, that there will always be gaps, and that the gaps are themselves informative. That what was not preserved, or could not be preserved, tells you something about the conditions under which things were lost. The diversity of the surviving fragments is part of what makes them rich as a source. You have technical logs from the detection and communications infrastructure, formal records that capture data and decisions in the format appropriate to their official function. You have personal communications, letters and messages that capture what people were thinking and feeling in ways that formal records do not. You have administrative documents, directives and responses that show the facility's official reasoning about its situation. And you have more ambiguous materials, notes and observations that do not have a clear functional category, that seem to have been written more for the writer's own processing than for any external audience. Each category of material has its strengths and its limitations. The technical logs are precise but context poor. They tell you what the instruments were registering, but not what the people monitoring those instruments were making of the readings, not what they were thinking when they looked at the data, not how the readings fit into the larger picture they were trying to construct. The personal communications are context-rich, but often imprecise about the factual details that would anchor them in the broader timeline. The administrative documents are formally clear, but often hide as much as they reveal, presenting a version of the facility's reasoning that is shaped by its official function, rather than its actual dynamics. The most valuable fragments are often the ones that sit between categories, that combine the specificity of technical observation with the contextual richness of personal reflection. There are a few of these in the Stella Montis materials, and they are worth spending time on because they offer the closest thing the lore has to a full picture of what it was like to be there in the later period. One fragment that is particularly striking describes the experience of monitoring the detection readings in the hours before the final events, from the perspective of a technical staff member who was not part of the restricted research program, but who was in close proximity to its effects through the data she was observing. The account combines precise technical description with an honest account of what it felt like to be looking at data that was moving in directions that exceeded her models. That was doing things she could not fully account for. The precision and the emotional honesty together produced something that is more illuminating than either would be alone. You understand not just what was happening, but what it meant to be watching it happen. What it felt like to have professional expertise that was being outpaced by the situation, to be doing your job correctly and still finding that doing your job correctly was not enough to make sense of what you were seeing. Another fragment, from someone closer to the restricted research program, describes the progression of the program's work in terms that are deliberately oblique, but that, read carefully, suggest a specific progression from investigation to engagement to something that the writer is struggling to characterize. The obliqueness is probably not dishonesty, but genuine uncertainty, the writer trying to describe something in a framework that the available vocabulary does not quite fit. Reading across these fragments, looking for consistency and for pattern, building a picture that uses each fragment to illuminate the others, is the methodological approach that the Stella Montis law rewards. No single fragment is sufficient. The picture builds from the accumulation, from noticing what multiple independent sources agree on and treating that consensus as relatively reliable, and from noticing where sources diverge and treating the divergence as informative about the differences in the perspectives from which the events were observed. The physical materials that have been recovered from the Stella Montis site, as distinct from the documentary materials carried out by survivors, include environmental evidence. That tells its own story. The arrangement of things, the state of equipment, the presence and absence of certain materials in certain locations, all of this is data about the events, data that complements and sometimes complicates the documentary record. Environmental evidence is read differently from documentary evidence. It does not come with the interpretive frame that human-produced documents carry. It has to be interpreted from the outside, without the author's intent to guide you. That makes it both more challenging and in some ways more reliable. It did not have an agenda. It simply is what the events left behind. The site's current state, in the game world, is a form of environmental evidence that players can encounter directly. The arrangement of the space, the specific character of the damage in different areas, the things that are present and the things that are conspicuously absent, all of this encodes information about what happened there. Reading the site as evidence, rather than simply as a game environment, is one of the things that Arc Raiders rewards players for doing. The fragments that come from the restricted research program itself, the records of what the program was doing and what it encountered, are the most limited in number and the most contested in interpretation. There are not many of them relative to the volume of other materials, and the ones that exist are often in states of partial preservation that make complete reading difficult, whether this is because the program's records were deliberately kept sparse, or because they were deliberately destroyed, or simply because the events did not spare them, is not clear. But what exists is significant. Even in their incomplete state, the program records suggest a progression of work that moved from well-understood territory into genuinely novel territory, and from there into something that exceeded the program's frameworks for understanding what was happening. The latter stages of the program records have a quality of struggle, of people trying to maintain analytical clarity under conditions that were straining their analytical capacity to its limits. There is a specific document in the Stella Montis materials that gets referenced repeatedly in discussions of the facility's final period. Its precise provenance is uncertain, as is its exact context within the program's documentation. But its content, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the available fragments, describes something that the restricted research program encountered that was not anticipated and was not fully understood in the moment of encountering it. The description is careful and specific and also genuinely uncertain in its own terms. A document written by someone who knows they are describing something important, but who does not have a complete framework for what they are describing. This document, more than any other single fragment, is what grounds the reading of Stella Montis as a place where something genuinely significant was attempted, and where the attempt produced consequences that were real and consequential for the broader Ark Raiders world. It is not a smoking gun in the sense of settling all interpretive questions. It is a significant piece of evidence that a particular reading of those questions is on the right track. The fragments from the community's final days are among the most affecting in the Stella Montis materials, not because they are the most important for understanding the events in a strategic or analytical sense, but because they carry the weight of human experience in a way that the technical and administrative materials do not. People who were not part of the restricted program, who did not know what was happening, but who were living inside the consequences of it, trying to maintain the ordinary. Routines that sustain communities under stress. There is something important about those fragments, about the insistence of ordinary life, even in extraordinary circumstances. The conversations about meals and sleep and personal relationships that appear in the late period materials are not separate from the Stella Montis story. They are part of it. They are what the story is about when it is being honest about what was at stake, which is not abstract institutional processes, but actual human beings with actual human concerns. The fragments that survive from the community's non-specialist members tend to be the ones most overlooked in discussions of Stella Montis, because they do not obviously contribute to understanding the strategic or scientific dimensions of what happened. But they contribute something else, something harder to quantify, but equally important. A sense of the human texture of the place, of what it was like to be there, of what was. Lost when the community that had formed there was destroyed. The gap in the record, the things that the surviving fragments do not tell you, is also worth reflecting on. The things that were not documented, or that were documented and not preserved, represent knowledge that is gone. In some cases, this is simply loss. In other cases, it may be consequential loss. Things that were known to people who are no longer available to share them. Things that would have changed the picture if they had survived. Working with incomplete records requires a kind of epistemic humility that is sometimes uncomfortable. You want to know things that you cannot know. You want the picture to be clearer than the evidence allows it to be. The temptation to fill the gaps with inference that exceeds the evidence is real, and this video has tried to resist it while still building the most complete picture the evidence actually supports. The fragments from the wreckage of Stella Montis, taken together, constitute a record of one of the more significant events in the Ark Raiders world, told from the inside, in the voices of the people who were there. Those voices are not uniform, not in agreement, not always reliable in the specific ways that formal documentation aspires to reliability. But they are real, or the game presents them as real, and they are the source of whatever understanding of Stella Montis is achievable. That understanding is partial. It is always going to be partial. The events were complex, the record is incomplete, and the interpretive frameworks we bring to the material are necessarily our own, shaped by our own prior understandings and our own ways of making sense of things. But partial understanding is still understanding, still worth having, still worth the effort of careful engagement with the materials. Chapter 8. What Stella Montis means for the world that came after. Stella Montis ended. But ending is not the same as disappearing, and the traces of what happened there are distributed through the Ark Raiders world in ways that become visible when you know where to look. The final chapter of this video is about those traces, about the specific ways the Stella Montis events shaped what came after them, and about what that shaping suggests for the broader narrative of the game's world. The most direct traces are the ones created by the survivors and the data they carried out. The factions and communities that received Stella Montis survivors were changed by their presence, and the changes can be tracked forward into subsequent events. The knowledge that arrived with those survivors, both the knowledge they consciously shared and the knowledge they carried without fully realizing its value, shaped decisions that had real consequences in the world. One of the most significant of those consequences involves the development of human response strategies for ARC engagement. The lessons of Stella Montis, contested and partial as they were, contributed to a shift in how certain factions understood the relationship between knowledge and risk in dealing with the ARC. Some of that shift moved in the direction of more caution, toward a greater awareness of the ways in which ambitious engagement with the ARC could produce consequences that outstripped the capacity to manage them. Some of it moved in the opposite direction, toward a greater appreciation of the value of that ambitious engagement despite its risks. Both of those trajectories are present in the post-Stella Montis lore of the ARC Raiders world, and both can trace a line back to the events and the survivors and the data that came out of the facility. The divergence in how the lessons were understood contributed to the divergence between factions and communities that is a significant feature of the game's world. The differences in approach and philosophy and strategy that make the world complex rather than monolithic. The detection work that Stella Montis had been doing, and that ended with the facility, left a gap in the network of human understanding about ARC behaviour. Some of what the facility had produced in that domain survived and was taken up by other institutions, but some of the most specialised and most advanced work was not fully replicated, either because the people who had done it were no longer in a position to continue, or because the specific institutional context of Stella Montis had been necessary for it in ways that could not easily be reproduced elsewhere. The gap in detection coverage and detection sophistication that resulted from the loss of Stella Montis had practical consequences for communities in the broader region. Understanding of ARC behaviour in that area was degraded for a period, and decisions made during that period of degraded understanding had consequences that would not have been the same if the facility had continued to operate. The downstream effects of institutional loss are often invisible to the people experiencing them, because you do not know what you would have known, only what you know. The physical site of Stella Montis itself became a feature of the world's geography that people navigated around and in relation to, not purely as a hazard, though there were hazard considerations, more as a reference point, a place that meant something, that carried the weight of what had happened there in ways that affected how people thought about it and what they did in its vicinity. The lore suggests that Stella Montis retained a kind of presence in the world's mental geography that exceeded its practical significance, that it was thought about and referenced in ways that reflected its having been a significant place rather than just a significant event. Some people return to the site. The lore points toward this without fully documenting it. The motivations for returning would have been various. Some people went back looking for things that had been left behind, physical things or records that might have survived the events. Some went back in a spirit that is harder to categorize, in pursuit of something more like understanding or closure, the kind of need that brings people back to places that have meant something to them, even when returning is difficult, and even when the place is no longer what it was. What people found when they returned, and what they made of it, is something the lore addresses obliquely. The site is not simply a ruin in the straightforward sense. It is a site where something happened that left marks beyond the physical damage, where the events have shaped the place in ways that go beyond what the destruction alone would explain. Exactly how to characterize those marks and what they imply about the nature of the events is left for the player and the lore reader to interpret. The broader implications of Stella Montis for the Ark Raiders world extend to the game's central questions about what human survival in an Ark-active world looks like and what it requires. The facility was an attempt to do more than survive, an attempt to understand and perhaps to engage with the thing that was threatening survival. That attempt failed in specific ways, but the failure was not simply an argument against ambition. It was an argument for better prepared ambition, for deeper understanding of the risks, for more honest accounting of what was known and what was not known. The characters in the Ark Raiders world who are navigating these questions, making decisions about how much to attempt and what risks to accept and what limits to respect, are doing so in a context that Stella Montis has shaped. The event is part of the world's history, part of the collective experience that informs how people think about possibility and danger. Whether they know the details of what happened at Stella Montis, or only know its rough outlines, or only know it as a name associated with catastrophic failure, it is part of the texture of the world they are navigating. The restricted research program's legacy is perhaps the most complex element of Stella Montis's long-term significance. The program had been doing something genuinely unprecedented, something that had produced results that were real even if they were also catastrophic. Those results are not simply gone. They exist in the records that survived, in the knowledge of the people who were close enough to the program to understand what it had achieved, in the downstream effects on Ark, behaviour that may or may not have persisted beyond the events themselves. Whether that legacy can be or should be built on is one of the live questions in the Ark Raiders world, and it is a question that the game's world does not answer cleanly. There are factions that would build on it, that see the Stella Montis program's achievements as the most significant advance in human understanding of the Ark in the invasion. That believe the path forward runs through extending and improving on what was done there rather than abandoning it. There are others who see the legacy as a warning, as evidence of the kinds of approaches that should not be pursued regardless of the potential gains. The game positions the player in relation to this ongoing debate without forcing a resolution. The world you are moving through is a world where these questions are live and contested, where the Stella Montis events are still being processed and interpreted, where the lessons are still being drawn and the implications are still being worked out. That is the world that Stella Montis created, the world that came after the events, still shaped by them, still living in their shadow. The human capacity to continue, to build and attempt and fail and attempt again, is one of the things the Ark Raiders world is about. Stella Montis is one of the clearest examples of that capacity being exercised at its limits, of people doing the most ambitious thing they could conceive of doing under conditions that were already extraordinary, and of the consequences of that exercise. Those consequences include destruction, but they also include knowledge and precedent, and the specific kind of understanding that only comes from having gone further than anyone has gone before, and having encountered what lives at that frontier. The world that came after Stella Montis is richer in understanding of what the frontier contains, and poorer in the people who explored it. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is part of what makes Stella Montis not just a tragedy, but a significant event, something that changed the world it happened in by the nature of what it attempted and the nature of what it encountered. There is no clean ending to the Stella Montis story. The events ended, but their effects did not, and the world of Ark Raiders is still, in the game's present, living inside those effects. The survivors are still out there, carrying what they know and what they experienced. The factions are still processing the lessons and making the choices that the lessons inform. The site is still there, marked by what happened, available to be encountered by anyone willing to go there and pay attention to what the place has to tell them. The story of Stella Montis is, finally, the story of what happens when human ambition meets its own limits in conditions where those limits cannot be tested cheaply. It is the story of a community that tried to do something extraordinary and paid an extraordinary price. It is the story of what was lost and what survived, and what the survival of certain things, knowledge, people, questions, means for the world going forward. It is a story worth telling carefully, worth sitting with, worth returning to, because the questions it raises are not resolved by the events themselves. They persist. Before you can talk about ARC behaviour in any serious way, you have to acknowledge the methodological problem that sits at the centre of all ARC analysis, which is that the ARC is not a subject that yields itself to the methods humans have most practiced for understanding things. The scientific tradition that produced the researchers at Stella Montis, the tradition of careful observation and controlled experimentation and falsifiable hypothesis formation, was built for a world in which the phenomena being studied do not respond to being studied. Physics does not change because you are looking at it. Chemistry does not alter its behaviour because you have an agenda. The ARC, if the Stella Montis law is taken seriously, may not work that way. This is the foundational problem of ARC analysis in the games world, and it is worth spending time with before proceeding to any specific claims about what the ARC does or why. If the phenomenon you are studying is capable of responding to your study, then your methodology has to account for that responsiveness, and standard scientific methodology does not easily do that. The feedback between observer and observed that the Stella Montis events suggest was possible is not an edge case that can be safely bracketed. It is central to what ARC analysis is and what its limits are. The people who were doing the most serious ARC analysis in the games world were aware of this problem to varying degrees. The detection work at Stella Montis and the parallel work being done at other nodes in the human survival network was built on methodological assumptions that were mostly inherited from the pre-invasion period, from a time when the thing being studied was assumed to be indifferent to the studying. Those assumptions were not always made explicit. They did not need to be made explicit, because they were built into the methods themselves, into the instruments and the data structures and the interpretive frameworks that they researchers were using. When the Stella Montis events suggested that those assumptions might be wrong, the challenge was not just intellectual. It was not simply a matter of updating a theoretical framework. The challenge was practical and immediate. If the thing you are studying changes its behaviour in response to your studying it, then every piece of data you have collected under the assumption of indifference has to be re-evaluated. The entire archive of ARC behavioural data, everything human researchers had accumulated, might be contaminated by the interaction between the observing and the observed. This is a destabilizing conclusion. It is the kind of conclusion that most institutions, most research programs, most people with significant investments in the validity of their existing knowledge would resist. And the evidence in the Stella Montis law is that this conclusion was in fact resisted, that the people most responsible for ARC analysis in the facility's later period were not fully willing to apply its implications to their own work. The implications were too costly. The alternative, the possibility that the data was good and the frameworks were adequate and the problem was manageable, was too appealing. The irony is that taking the conclusion seriously, really seriously, and rebuilding ARC analysis from the ground up on different methodological foundations might have been the approach most likely to produce the kind of understanding that the restricted research program was seeking. The attempt to use existing methods to get at something those methods were not designed to reach may have been precisely what produced the problematic feedback. A different approach might have been less immediately productive, but also less immediately dangerous. whether that different approach was available, whether anyone at Stella Montis was actually thinking along those lines and was in a position to advocate for them, is something the law does not directly address. But the shape of the failure points toward the methodological problem as a significant contributing factor, not just human fallibility or resource pressure or authority conflict, but a genuine epistemic problem with how the Ark was being understood and studied. The broader implication for the Ark Raiders world is that the knowledge humans have accumulated about the Ark, the entire body of behavioral data and analytical frameworks and predictive models, needs to be held with more uncertainty than most of the people using it would be comfortable with. The data was collected in conditions where observer effects may have been operating. The frameworks were built on assumptions that may be false. The models produce predictions that may be accurate for reasons other than the ones the models encode. This does not mean the knowledge is worthless. Predictions can be accurate for wrong reasons. Frameworks can be useful without being correct. But it does mean that the confidence with which people in the games world use Ark behavioral knowledge should be calibrated differently than it generally is, and that one of the significant things the Stella Montis events contributed to the world was a reason to recalibrate if people were willing to take that reason seriously. Some of them were. The law points toward at least a few figures in the post-Stella Montis world who engaged seriously with the methodological implications and tried to develop approaches to Ark analysis that would be less vulnerable to the feedback problem. What they produced and how it was received is part of the downstream story of Stella Montis that the game's lore traces without fully developing. But its presence in the lore as a thread worth following suggests it is significant, that the game considers the epistemological question to be part of the story rather than a side note. The Ark in this framing is not just a threat, it is a philosophical problem, a challenge to how knowledge works and how knowledge should be pursued in a world where the thing you are trying to know is not merely unknown but is possibly responsive to the knowing. Stella Montis is the place where that challenge was most vividly confronted, where the methodological assumptions broke down most visibly, where the gap between what humans thought they knew about the Ark and what the Ark actually was became most suddenly apparent. That gap is not closed by the events. If anything, it is widened by them. The events demonstrated that the gap was larger than the people who had been studying the Ark had recognized. And one of the things the world that came after Stella Montis inherited was a larger and more clearly delineated gap between human understanding and Ark reality than anyone had previously had to reckon with. Chapter 10. Pattern without intention. The first interpretive framework. The dominant interpretive framework for Ark behavior in the game's world before Stella Montis, and still largely operative after it, treats Ark behavior as patterned without being intentional. This is a specific and important distinction. Patterned behavior can be predicted and responded to without requiring any theory of what the pattern generator is or what it is trying to accomplish. You do not need to understand the Ark to survive it if you can reliably predict what it will do next. The detection work at Stella Montis and elsewhere was premised on this framework. Find the patterns, use them to predict, use the predictions to survive. The framework has real virtues. It keeps the analysis tractable. It avoids the kind of speculative anthropomorphization that has historically led humans to miscategorize natural phenomena. It produces testable predictions that can be evaluated against outcomes and refined over time. It is, in its own terms, a scientifically respectable approach to a genuinely difficult problem. The limitation of the framework is that it works best when the patterns are stable, when you can observe enough examples to characterize the pattern reliably, and when the pattern does not change in response to being observed. If the Ark's behavior is actually intentional, or if it is responsive in ways that fall short of intention, but exceed the simple pattern generation that the framework assumes, then the framework will systematically mischaracterize the data it is working with. It will find patterns that are real but misidentify their nature. It will make predictions that are accurate until they are not, and the failure mode will not be random but systematic, tracking the actual character of the arc rather than the assumed character. The Stella Montis detection data, over the period the law allows you to reconstruct, shows something that looks like the framework's failure mode. The patterns that the detection system had characterized over the facility's operational period were reliable up to a point, and then they were not. The divergence was not random. It had a specific shape. The arc's behavior near the facility began to diverge from its broader regional patterns in ways that were consistent with a response to what the facility was doing rather than with the continuation of whatever pattern had been operating before. The researchers who were working within the pattern without intention framework were not well positioned to see this divergence for what it was. Within their framework, divergence from established patterns was an anomaly to be explained within the framework, rather than evidence against the framework itself. The anomaly might be explained by environmental factors, by the facility's physical characteristics, by coincidental variations in arc activity that happen to be spatially correlated with the facility's location. The framework provided multiple options for explaining away the divergence before having to entertain the possibility that the divergence was what it appeared to be. This is not unique to the arc researchers. It is a general feature of how frameworks operate. A framework that surrendered to falsification at the first anomaly would not be very useful, because real-world data is always messy and anomalies are always present. The question is at what point the anomalies become sufficiently numerous and sufficiently coherent that they overwhelm the framework's capacity to explain them away. At what point the simpler hypothesis is that the framework is wrong, rather than that the anomalies have an alternative explanation. At Stella Montis, there is evidence in the law that some people reach that point before others. The technical staff who were doing the monitoring without the investment in the restricted research program's theoretical framework were, as discussed earlier, arriving at alarming interpretations of the data relatively early. Their alarm was, in this reading, an appropriate response to the failure of the dominant framework to adequately characterize what the data was showing. The broader population of researchers and staff who had been living with the pattern without intention framework for longer, who had built careers on it, who had used it successfully for years, and who had every reason to be confident in it, was slower to reach the point of framework abandonment. This is human and understandable. It is also consequential. The pattern without intention framework's failure at Stella Montis is one of the most important events in the game's intellectual history if you take the law seriously as building a coherent world with its own history of ideas. The framework did not simply fail to predict a specific set of events. It failed in a way that revealed its underlying assumptions to be inadequate for the phenomenon it was attempting to characterize. That is a deeper failure than a predictive miss. It is a structural failure that requires rebuilding the analytical approach from more fundamental questions about what the arc actually is, rather than just refining the pattern. Detection methods within the existing framework. Whether that rebuilding happened, and what it produced, is one of the questions the post-Stella Montis law is circling around, without having answered cleanly by the point in the timeline that the game's current materials reach. The attempt to rebuild is present. The people trying to do it are present. But the world is still living largely within the pattern, without intention framework, still using instruments and methods that inherit its assumptions, still making predictions, and acting on them with a degree of confidence that the Stella Montis events, properly absorbed, should have reduced. The persistence of an inadequate framework after its inadequacy has been demonstrated is not surprising. Frameworks are embedded in institutions, in training programs, in equipment design, in the standard operating procedures that have been built up around them. Replacing a framework is not simply a matter of having a better argument. It requires changing all the things that the framework is embedded in, which requires resources and coordination and will that are in short supply in a world fighting for survival. The tension between knowing the framework is wrong and continuing to use it because you do not have a better one and cannot afford the disruption of trying to build one is one. Of the live tensions in the Ark Raiders world's intellectual landscape. Stella Montis is the place where the wrongness of the framework was demonstrated most vividly, but the demonstration did not automatically produce the institutional response that demonstration in a more stable world might have produced. Chapter 11. The second framework. Intention without comprehensible goal. The second major interpretive framework for Ark behavior is one that the law presents, primarily through the people who hold it, rather than through any formal statement of it, because in the games world it tends to be held in ways that are not fully articulable by its holders. Call it the intention without comprehensible goal framework. It posits that Ark behavior is intentional in some meaningful sense, that there is something like purpose behind what the Ark does, but that the purpose is not comprehensible in terms of human categories of motivation and goal direction. This framework is, in some ways, more honest about the limits of human understanding than the pattern without intention framework. It acknowledges that the Ark might be something fundamentally different from what human analytical categories are built to handle, that the attempt to understand it purely in terms of pattern and prediction might be missing something essential about its nature, but it pays for that honesty with a kind of analytical paralysis. If the Ark has intentions, but those intentions are not comprehensible to humans, then what is the productive response? You cannot negotiate with intentions you cannot understand. You cannot anticipate them reliably. You can barely discuss them without importing human conceptual frameworks that may be systematically misleading. The people in the games world who tend to hold something like this framework are not a uniform group. Some of them hold it as a counsel of despair, as a reason not to try to understand the Ark beyond the bare minimum required for survival. Others hold it as a motivation for a different kind of engagement, for the attempt to develop new conceptual tools that might eventually make Ark intention, at least partially, legible, even if the full content of that intention remains permanently beyond human grasp. The Stella Montis Restricted Research Program, in this reading, can be understood as an attempt to move from the first framework to something more like the second, from pattern analysis to something that took seriously the possibility of Ark intentionality and tried to engage with it directly, rather than simply modelling it from the outside. The programme's ambition was not just to predict Ark behaviour more accurately, but to approach Ark behaviour as the behaviour of something that was doing something that had whatever it is that functions like reasons for what it did. That ambition was, in the context of the game's world, genuinely radical. The pattern without intention framework was not just an academic position, it was the practical basis for nearly all human defensive work in the invasion period. Challenging it, even implicitly, meant challenging the basis of those practices and the authority of the people whose expertise was built on them. The restricted programme's work was therefore politically sensitive in ways that went beyond the usual sensitivity of restricted research. Whether the programme's practitioners fully understood the political dimensions of what they were doing is uncertain. Scientists and researchers embedded in a specific programme often do not have a clear view of the institutional politics that surround their work. They see the intellectual problem they are working on and the people they are working with, and the broader political landscape is abstracted for them by the institutional structures that mediate between their work and the world. The Stella Montis researchers may have been surprised, if they had occasion to be surprised, by how strongly some people outside the programme felt about the direction of their inquiry. The intention without comprehensible goal framework taken seriously, also has implications for how the arc's specific behaviour at Stella Montis is understood. If the arc was responding intentionally to what the facility was doing, and if that intention is in principle not fully comprehensible in human terms, then the attempt to understand the response by asking what the arc was trying to accomplish may be precisely the wrong approach. The question presupposes that arc intention can be mapped onto a human model of goal-directed behaviour, that you can identify something like the arc's objectives and reason backward from them to explain specific behaviours. A less anthropomorphic approach might focus on the structure of the response rather than its content, on what kinds of inputs produce what kinds of outputs, on the relationship between the character of human activity and the character of arc response, without committing to a theory of what the arc was trying to do. This is, in a sense, a hybrid of the two frameworks, taking from the first a focus on predictable patterns and taking from the second an acknowledgement that those patterns might be the surface of something more than mechanism. The hybrid approach is harder to operationalize than either pure framework. It requires holding uncertainty in a productive rather than a paralyzing way. It requires being willing to describe patterns without explaining them, to note correlations without committing to a theory of what produces them, to operate usefully in an epistemic space where the fundamental questions are not settled. That is intellectually uncomfortable in ways that both the pure frameworks, each in its own way, allow you to avoid. But it may be the most honest approach available, an honesty about the limits of what is known. In a situation where overconfidence is demonstrably dangerous, has practical as well as intellectual value. The Stella Montis events are, among other things, a demonstration of the costs of overconfidence in the face of genuine uncertainty. The people there were working with frameworks that were insufficient for what they were dealing with, and they were not, collectively, adequately uncertain about those frameworks. The result was a kind of epistemic brittleness, a tendency to interpret new information in terms of existing frameworks rather than as potential evidence against those frameworks. That left them less prepared for the failure modes that the frameworks could not anticipate. Chapter 12, Scale, Scope, and the question of distributed awareness. One of the questions that arc behavioral analysis in the games world keeps circling around is the question of scale. Specifically, is the arc a single thing that behaves as a unified entity, or is it an aggregate of many things that behave independently but produce collective patterns that look like unified behavior? The distinction matters enormously for both theory and practice. If the arc is a unified entity, then behaviours observed in one region can potentially inform understanding of behaviours in other regions, because a unified entity has some form of consistent underlying nature that expresses itself coherently across all its manifestations. Communication with or understanding of the arc, if possible at all, would be communication with or understanding of that unified nature. The Stella Montis restricted program's attempt to engage directly with the arc, in this framing, was an attempt to reach the thing that is actually there, behind all the specific manifestations. If the arc is an aggregate, then the situation is very different. What looks like unified behaviour may be the emergent property of many independent actors following simple rules, the way that complex collective behaviour emerges from simple individual rules in biological systems. In that case, understanding the aggregate's behaviour does not require understanding anything that resembles a unified will or intention. And engaging with one part of the aggregate does not mean engaging with the whole, does not mean that the response will be coherent or that it will reflect the aggregate's collective state rather than just the local state of the part you are engaging with. The law does not settle this question, and the game's design choice not to settle it is correct. A settled answer in either direction would make the arc smaller, would make it more manageable conceptually, even if not practically. The uncertainty is part of what makes the arc genuinely threatening at the level of meaning, rather than just at the level of physical danger. But the Stella Montis events bear on the question in ways worth noting. The pattern of arc response to the facility's restricted program work was, by the account of the detection data, coordinated in a way that the simple aggregate following local rules model does not easily explain. Local aggregates following local rules would not be expected to produce the kind of regionally coherent response pattern that the data suggests. That pattern looks more like information being passed through a distributed system, like a response that involved more than just the immediate local arc elements. Whether that distributed response implies unified awareness, or simply a sufficiently rich communication medium among arc elements that allows complex collective behavior to emerge from distributed components, is not determined by the Stella Montis data alone, but it is suggestive. It suggests that whatever the arc is, it has enough internal coherence to coordinate responses across spatial scales larger than any single local cluster. That is significant, regardless of how you characterize the nature of that coherence. The implication for behavioral prediction is that arc behavior near any given location may be influenced by what is happening at locations that are not geographically proximate. A model that treats arc behavior as purely local, as generated by the characteristics of the immediate environment and the immediate human activity in a specific region, may be missing a significant explanatory variable. The possibility that what is happening at one node of the human survival network affects arc behavior elsewhere, because the arc's distributed system propagates information in ways that correlate arc responses across spatial distances is not ruled out by the available evidence, and is in fact suggested by some of it. The operational implications are serious. If true, it means that aggressive or unusual human activity in any given location is not just a risk to that location. It is a potential source of altered arc behavior at entirely different locations. The facilities and communities that were doing the most ambitious work in terms of arc engagement were not just putting themselves at risk. They were potentially altering the risk environment for everyone. Whether they knew this, and whether this knowledge was part of the information landscape that the Stella Montis researchers were operating in, is something the law gestures toward without fully addressing. There is a specific question worth raising in this context about whether Stella Montis's restricted program was the only facility in the game's world that was attempting the kind of direct arc engagement that the program seems to have been pursuing. The law suggests there may have been others, parallel programs at other locations, either coordinated with Stella Montis or independently developed. If there were parallel programs, and if the distributed nature of the arc means that arc responses are influenced by the aggregate of human engagement attempts rather than just by each one individually, then the risk profile of the Stella Montis program was shaped not just by what Stella Montis itself was doing, but by the broader landscape of similar attempts. This is a possibility that would have been very difficult to account for, even by the most careful risk analysis conducted at the individual facility level. You cannot fully characterize the risk of your own engagement attempt if part of that risk depends on what other actors you may not even know about are doing simultaneously. The distributed nature of both the human survival network and the arc itself created conditions in which the risks of any individual action were not fully determinable from any individual vantage point. The scale question also bears on the question of whether the Stella Montis events represented a failure of engagement with the arc in general, or a failure of a specific kind of engagement at a specific level of intensity. If the arc responds to the aggregate of human engagement attempts, then the threshold for triggering an intensified arc response depends on the sum of human activity across multiple locations, not just on any individual facility's actions. The Stella Montis program may have been the one that pushed the aggregate past a threshold without being, in isolation, more risky than several other programs that continued. Operating without incident. This is a disturbing implication. It means that the lesson of Stella Montis, if that lesson is understood as do not do the kind of thing Stella Montis was doing, may be the wrong lesson. The relevant variable may not have been the character of what Stella Montis was doing, but the combined intensity of what multiple facilities were doing. Applying the lesson by shutting down programs similar to Stella Montis's would address the symptom, while potentially missing the underlying dynamic. Whether anyone in the game's world reached this conclusion and acted on it is not something the available law makes clear. But the possibility is present in the materials, a thread that can be pulled on to get to a different understanding of what Stella Montis means and what the appropriate response to what happened there actually was. Chapter 13. The memory problem. Does the ARC learn? There is a question that surfaces repeatedly in serious ARC behavioral analysis in the game's world, and it is one that the Stella Montis events make more urgent. Does the ARC learn? Does the ARC's behavior in any given situation reflect only the current state of the relevant inputs? Or does it also reflect accumulated information about past interactions? Past human activities? Past ARC responses? Is there, in short, anything like memory in the ARC's distributed system? The question matters for prediction. A system without memory is, in principle, fully predictable from its current state inputs. A system with memory is predictable only if you have complete information about the history of inputs that have shaped its current state, which in the real world you never do. The introduction of memory into a predictive model dramatically increases the model's complexity and dramatically decreases the practical achievability of reliable prediction. The law does not settle this question either, and again, the design choice not to settle it is the right one. But the Stella Montis events offer data points that are relevant to it. The pattern of ARC response to the facility's activities did not appear to treat each new piece of human behaviour as a fresh input to be processed independently. It appeared to involve something more cumulative, a response that built on previous interactions rather than resetting with each new observation period. If that appearance is accurate, it has significant implications. It means that the history of human ARC interactions in any given region is itself a factor in the ARC's current behaviour in that region. That what happened at Stella Montis Inn. The past affected how the ARC responded to Stella Montis in the present in ways that went beyond the current physical characteristics of the facility. The facility had, in some sense, built up a relationship with the ARC over its operational period, a relationship that shaped the specific character of the ARC's eventual response. The word relationship is being used carefully here. It is not meant to import human categories of relationship, not meant to suggest that the ARC formed an attachment or developed a preference or anything of that kind. It is meant to suggest something more minimal, that the history of interactions between a specific human location and the local ARC presence affected the parameters of their subsequent interactions in a way that is not reducible to the current physical state of either party. If this minimal sense of relationship is accurate for Stella Montis, it may be accurate more generally. Every human community that has been operating in an ARC-active environment has a history of interaction with the local ARC presence, and that history may be shaping the specific character of ARC behaviour in that location in ways that a purely present-tense analysis would miss. The detection methods that most human analysts are using, methods that model ARC behaviour as a function of current physical inputs, would systematically fail to capture this. Historical dimension. The implication for the broader project of understanding ARC behaviour is uncomfortable. It means that the accumulated data archive of ARC observations may be harder to use than it appears, because the conditions under which any specific observation was made included a historical context that is not fully captured in the observation record. Observations from location A at time t are not directly comparable to observations from location B at time t, because the ark's behaviour at location A at time t is partly a function of the history of ark-human interactions at location A, which is different from the history at location B, and that difference is not represented in a dataset that simply records current states. This is an epistemological problem of significant scope. It does not mean ark analysis is impossible. It means that ark analysis conducted as if history does not matter is less reliable than it appears to be, and that improving ark analysis requires developing methods that can account for historical dimension in a principled way, which is considerably harder than the current methods and would require resources and methodological development that the current world situation makes difficult to pursue. The restricted research program at Stella Montis may have been, in its own way, grappling with this problem. The attempt to engage directly with the ark, rather than simply to model it from the outside, can be understood as an attempt to get past the limitations of observational methods. That cannot capture the historical dimension. If you can establish some form of direct engagement, you might be able to get information about the ark's state that is not available through external observation. Information that could include whatever the ark's equivalent of historical memory looks like, whether that is what the program was attempting, and whether it made progress on it, and whether the response the program eventually provoked was related to the program's. Attempts to access this historical dimension are questions the law raises without answering, but the shape of the problem points in that direction, and it is a direction that has significance for understanding not just Stella Montis, but the broader project of ark. Behavioural analysis in the game's world. The memory question also connects to the question of whether the Stella Montis events left any lasting mark on ark behaviour in the broader region, beyond the immediate aftermath. If the ark learns, or if there is a functional analogue of learning in its distributed system, then the Stella Montis events were not just an ending for the facility. They were an input that potentially changed the ark's behaviour in ways that persist. What those changes were, if they existed, and whether they can be detected in the post-Stella Montis record of ark activity in the region, is a genuinely interesting empirical question that the game's lore points toward without having answered. Chapter 14, The Signal and the Noise, a Technical Reading. The detection system at Stella Montis produced a record that the lore describes in ways that are technically specific enough to support a careful reading, even though the game does not provide anything like a physics textbook. Working from what the lore actually says, rather than importing assumptions from outside it, you can build a picture of what the detection data looked like and what it suggested about ark behaviour that is more precise than the broad strokes summary that most discussions of Stella Montis employ. The baseline ark signature in the region around Stella Montis, as established in the facility's early operational period, had characteristics that the detection system had, characterized well enough to use as a reference standard. What this means technically is that the system had built up enough observation data to distinguish signal from noise, to separate the features of ark presence that were stable and consistent from the features that were variable. The stable features defined the baseline. Deviations from the baseline were what the system was most attentive to. In the early and middle periods of the facility's operation, deviations from the baseline were relatively rare and relatively modest. The ark presence in the region was broadly consistent with what the facility's models predicted based on broader regional ark activity patterns. The predictive models worked well enough to be trusted. The trust was earned, and the earning of it was a significant investment of observational effort over a significant period of time. The deviations that began to appear in the detection record in the later period were different in kind from the deviations that had appeared earlier, not just in magnitude but in their temporal structure. Earlier deviations tended to be transient, to appear and then return to baseline within predictable intervals. The later deviations had a different temporal structure. They persisted. They accumulated rather than reverting. The baseline itself began to shift. The reference standard against which deviations were measured was no longer stable because the thing it had been measuring was in the process of changing. The technical difficulty this creates for analysis is significant. If your baseline is shifting, the question of whether current readings represent a deviation from normal or simply a new normal becomes unanswerable in real time. You need historical perspective to tell the difference, and in a situation developing as rapidly as the Stella Montis situation was developing, historical perspective was increasingly unavailable.